Hey, folks, we've got another episode of the Bulwark Disclosure Podcast here today. Thanks for everybody who has tuned in to watch it. And I want to welcome our guest today, who I'm absolutely thrilled to have joining us here today. We have neurosurgeon and kind of a pioneer in decentralized health and medicine, Dr. Jack Kruse. Jack, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, no problem. Anytime.
Really appreciate it. And again, I said I'm very excited to talk to you. If anybody isn't familiar with Dr. Kruse and his work, he's been talking about these things for quite a long time at this point. He's, like I said, a neurosurgeon and kind of focuses on this concept of decentralized health and medicine. He has had patients like Rick Rubin and Jack Dorsey and people who he's really helped, kind of turn their lives around in a lot of ways. And he spent a significant portion of his life, divulging these kind of secrets and the level of corruption that we have right now in our medical and pharmaceutical and big tech industries that he's really learned about firsthand. So I want to thank you for that everything you do with, exposing this type of corruption. Um, and I can relate to that a lot too. I've spent a good portion of my life now studying and trying to understand the history of MKUltra and these different social engineering projects because I really think it's probably the most important thing in the world for people to understand. Like Aldous Huxley said, if you don't know that you're a slave, how can you ever have a chance of becoming, not a slave anymore? So I just think, you provide a really unique perspective to a lot of these things. And I'm excited to talk to you today, man.
All right.
Maybe somewhere that we could start out is you giving us a little bit of your, just kind of a synopsis of your background, the different work that you've done, and maybe kind of when you started to realize these different, aspects of the medical health industries and all this corruption that's kind of lying underneath the surface.
Well, I mean, the stuff that you really want to talk about, which isn't really the health stuff, that actually began even before my health journey, because it started, I would tell you, probably before my residency started and into the first year of my residency, because I had spent quite a bit of time down at LSU in Charity Hospital. And there I intercalated myself to, the ER nurses, the medical staff, the hospital itself, and decided, here I was a New York kid born and bred on the streets, going to go to the deep South. And little did I know that the vortex that taught me about money as a young kid in New York, because I worked for the richest people in the world, when school was out and it snowed, I used to dig their Rolls Royces and Mercedes out of the snow. Those were the people that actually taught me the basics of how fiat money really works, how the banking system really works in the United States. They taught me about the Federal Reserve System. They actually taught me about the links that I mentioned in Danny's podcast to benign birth.
Hmm.
In fact, the person that taught me was a member of benign birth.
Wow.
That's actually how I found out about it, and what their modus operandi really was. And then, stepping into the medicine side of things, going to New Orleans, and I didn't really know much about the JFK issue except what, I was told by my parents and what was in Life magazine. Because for my mom specifically, JFK's assassination was a big event in her life. And she always said to me, she goes, I know something untoward happened, but I have no, way of putting the dots together. And then when I went down to LSU and realized that I was actually in ground zero, where all of this stuff went on from really 1951 through 1963. And,
Mhm.
that 12, 13-year history is really germane in understanding how the government, the FBI, the mob all gets linked up, because it's I think it's an interesting story because really it's a historical event. And when you realize that the victors write the history books, then you begin to understand why it's not in our history books.
Mhm.
And the only way this story, I think, can be told is through my firsthand accounts of actually kind of what happened. And when I saw this unfold in the beginning, as a true scientist would do, I needed confirmation because, I know there's a lot of bullshit out there. There's a lot of conspiracy theories, even back then when I was a young guy. And the things that I was hearing, I have to say, bordered on the absurd to me. And but I always tell people it's the mark of an educated mind to take something you fundamentally don't believe, examine it for yourself, and see, is it truly conspiracy or bullshit, or is there some deep truth to it? And then if you do find a deep truth, I think then you have to jump down the rabbit hole and do, the heavy lifting of examining, was this just a nugget of truth, or was there something here truly buried?
Mhm.
And I did that. And when I came to the conclusion, at least on the political side, what happened in Louisiana at that time, I pretty much made all those confirmation things within probably 2 years of my residency. So you have to remember, here I am still training to be a neurosurgeon, but I realized that a lot of the things that I was being taught in medical school, a lot of the things I was being taught in residency may not be as true as I thought. And the real, I think, really come to Jesus moment for me, and this is the truth. You would think it's probably from your stuff that you're interested in. It's not. It was actually when I realized who Robert O. Becker was, for my specialty and for what he did for medicine. And then to realize that he was canceled because of the same nefarious stuff that was going on in 51 through 63. And I couldn't fathom that these stories were linked.
Mhm.
And it was because of my mentor in neurosurgery that I get pushed down this rabbit hole. Like, he had no idea about any of this stuff. Why? Because, he's a world famous neurosurgeon, who, by the way, recently just died, just in the last 2 weeks, since
Oh,
he
wow.
got died the day of the Danny Jones podcast. And the um the story began to crystallize for me that in health, that I needed to jump down some more rabbit holes. Like, in other words, what I was taught wasn't gospel and I shouldn't take it as such. And in other words, the heterodox position was actually the correct position to take, in matters of at least health and wealth.
Mhm.
And little did I know at that time that they were intertwined, like caduceus symbol for medicine, but they actually were. And I think the further I went through my residency, I think the more that I buried the story and said, look, I need to finish what I've started, come out and do what I do. And then when I came out and did what I did, I began to realize I was banging my head up against the wall, that many of the things I was doing to people really was based on faulty logic.
Mhm.
And that's when, I had my own come to Jesus moment around 2005, and was out giving talks on, instruments that I came up with. And I happened to be at the foot of Michelangelo's statue when everything that was an experience up to my life at that time began to make some sense to me. And, I was about 40 years old at that time. And that 18 months was the hardest 18 months of my life. That's kind of, if you listen to the 4.5 hours I did with Danny, I tried to explain to people, that's when I realized where all the pieces kind of fit. It wasn't just the health story.
Mhm.
I actually realized how the Theodore Silbert part of the banking story fit in, how the JFK part fit in, how the stuff that happened with Jim Garrison fit in.
Mhm.
I began to realize about the Cantillon effect of big pharma. I began to realize how this whole thing was put together. And The irony was I knew there was an evolution in the story, and the evolution was kind of good because this come to Jesus moment for me happened before Obama gets in the White House. But it happens relatively soon after the Patriot Act and 9/11.
Hmm.
Uh, and in this whole process, I went down a lot of rabbit holes to see if the recent events, after my residency were actually connected to the political events going on. And I found deep ties to actually all of them. And then when Obama comes in and we get the great financial crisis, in the Bush to Obama transition, and I find out that Barry Soetoro is linked to Bush, I begin to realize this this conspiracy that began with General Groves is actually completely gone on. And it turns out the president that they took out was the last one that they didn't control, which was JFK.
Hmm.
So at the end of this 18-month event, this is when I go visit Robert O. Becker. This is, towards the end of his life. He's maybe 12 to 18 months before he dies. And we sit down and we share notes. And obviously, the real reason we met is I was provocative with him. I said, look, you've written all these books. You said that it's not really about biochemistry. It's about the electromagnetic footprint, that the DC electric current controls regeneration in all animals and plants. Your studies are exquisite, but you were canceled because of your work with the military. So remember, he gets canceled in 77 through 79. So he's had a long time to think about his issue. Since all his funding was taken away, his time in science really was almost turned off. It's like, you turning off the light in a room. And I hate to say this, but he almost stopped doing what he was doing when they took his lab away from him. So I felt that I had a duty to go and talk to him before he died to point out to him where the DC electric current comes from. Because he was very exquisite in describing it and its power. And when I sat down and told him, I said, look, I want to come meet with you. I want to talk to you. My hook, since you're a musician, you probably understand this a little bit. The hook was, I'll tell you where the DC electric current comes from if you meet with me. But really what I wanted to go up there and talk to him about was what happened to him between 79 and 2005, 2006, to see if he gave any thought to why he was really canceled, to share notes about that part. And I think that was probably one of the most interesting meetings that I ever had, especially because it came right after the health Eureka moments when everything came together. And I said, look, I need to talk to you about how I'm going to continue on with your work. And that's when the discussion got real. That's when he told me the story about how he really got canceled, why he was so pissed off. And I almost hate to say this because I did not know the man well, but I felt like after that meeting, it's this crazy thing to admit now. I don't think I've ever told anybody this. He reminded me of me. He was very blunt, very gruff, and he was fucking pissed. He really was mad. And he was mad specifically at centralized science because they had diminished his work for so long because nobody could believe that the regeneration control mechanism in cells was electromagnetic and not biochemical. That was so heterodox at the time, but it turned out his experiments showed that he was absolutely correct. And the reason it was buried from me as a scientist is very similar to what I laid out in Danny Jones. The reason why you guys don't know anything about Bernice Eddy and the Cutter event. It was whitewashed from history for a reason. Why? Because the government decided to use it as a bioweapon. And in that sense, non-native EMF, the aberrant use of light, is very similar to the polio jab. And that, because of current events, makes it very similar to the messenger RNA jabs that are present today. And I think this idea for most people in 2020 through 2024 was conspiratorial. Why? Because you didn't have the opportunity to tie all the loose ends up. Actually, you could saw the disbelief even in somebody like Danny Jones, because he was a conspiracy, I don't say theorist, but someone who was interested in talking about this stuff,
Hmm.
but didn't have anybody on his show that really had, that really wasn't at ground zero for a lot of the events that were linked together.
Hmm.
That's the way I look at it. He had a lot of people, and just like I'm sure you've probably focused on a lot of people, we really focus in on the CIA, the government side, and the mob side. Why? Because that's the sexy side for conspiracy theorists to talk about. But when you actually introduce the biologic side, that's when things get really real. And when you can link something that happened 75 years ago to something that actually just occurred in all of our lives that we all collectively have experienced,
Hmm.
that's actually when, guess what? The history lesson begets, or you get a real dose of reality. Like, that's a wake up call.
Hmm.
And not only that, I tried to explain to all of you that that was the wake up call that I tried to deliver to Bobby Kennedy and Rick. Like, when I talked to Rick about this before we did the podcast, he goes, "You're going to unleash this like right in his lap during the podcast." And I'm like, "Yeah." And I said, "I'm going to tell you, it's going to go one of two ways. Either he's going to skate right over it, or he's not going to realize the implications of what I'm saying." And it turned out that was actually true. I don't think he got it fully when I let it in his lap. But when did I know that he got it fully? When he called me back 6 weeks later and said, "Hey, that law that you wrote for Bukele, can we use, a couple of pages of it in our presidential platform?" Because he began to realize that his real plan of lawfare against the industrial military complex was going to have significant problems. Now, you're fortunate by doing this podcast with me, because now I can talk to you about something that's happened in the last 2 weeks since the Danny Jones podcast that nobody knows about. I don't even know if I've been clear to talk about it, but I don't give a fuck. I'm still going to say it. Sergey Brin is now going after Nicole Shanahan because of these things. And
Wow.
he's attempting to take his daughter Echo away from Nicole, saying she's mentally ill. Now, just think about the brass cojones of this guy.
Hmm.
He's part of this whole story. He's the guy that's like the leading candidate for the marshmallow experiment. He's a party boy. He's linked to Epstein. He's on a lot of
Yep.
Epstein's lists,
Yep.
but somehow Nicole, who's had an awakening, is part of the fringe.
Hmm.
But it's okay that the transhumanist, um, guys linked to the Mossad and the MKUltra part of the story have no issues, and realize because he's got huge amount of wealth and their marriage, their dissolution, and the child lives in California, because he lives in the most communist state in the United States, he has an audience.
Hmm.
So I told Nicole this when I talked to her, that you're too nice to these motherfuckers. It's time for you to come out and tell people the truth about all the things you know. And trust me, I know that she knows a ton. Why? Because her and I talked about it. That's probably going to be for her to deliver in her own way. But I can tell you that I'm okay dropping what I just told to you, because I think everybody who listens to this podcast needs to know, because Nicole got awake. Remember, Bobby asked Nicole to be the vice presidential candidate. She didn't put her 2 cents into this. Now, the other side, the people that fund Kamala, the people that are on the side of the industrial military complex, the people that are inside on the side of the people linked to the Trotskyites that, are filled in academia,
Hmm.
specifically Stanford, Hopkins, everybody that was linked initially to ARPANET, they are now going to come after her with the full force of lawfare to try to do everything we possibly can. Now, if you remember, Elon Musk just got on Tucker Carlson and said, "Look, I think one of the real problems here is the people that are on the left, the Sergey Brin's, the Susan Wojcicki's, his ex-wife, they're really concerned about what's going to come out if Trump truly gets in." And I'm going to tell you, they're being very proactive about going after the targets they can go after. And Nicole happens to be one of those targets.
Is that why some of them have literally just died recently? I mean, from Susan Wojcicki, her son overdosed
Well,
mysteriously a couple months ago.
I'm going to tell you that I can't tell you the details that I know about, but I will tell you where I think some of the law enforcement, if
Hmm.
the Department of Justice changes after January 20th, 2025,
Yeah,
the number one thing they need to do is it's going to be very easy to prove the issue with the Wojcicki sister that died from a relatively aggressive form of cancer. She was a
right.
non-smoker and died of a cancer linked to smoking. So
Hmm.
this certainly tells you this is an SV40 kind of problem. So all one needs to do is go there. I also think that the key thing for Marco Tropo, which is who her son was, most people don't know that he killed himself 4 months before his mother died. He was at Cal Berkeley, and this kid was decidedly different than his mother.
Yeah.
Um, and he was pretty outspoken about it, and he was forced to have to take some of the jabs. And my bet, if law enforcement goes and petitions Cal Berkeley's, especially their network, you might find out some interesting things about why he did what he did. It may not be what you think. And I
I
think
might
the
I might be wrong, but I think the news reports were that it was an accidental overdose. Is that not correct? He committed suicide?
I don't know how you can call anything an accident or not
Sure.
when the toxicology report shows that the drugs in the system are the same type of drugs that we see in every school shooter
Hmm.
in the United States,
Hmm.
which is also kind of interesting because this links to the new evolution of MKUltra,
Right.
which is the Brain Health Initiative. But I will tell you, I have a sense that if one studies what he was doing in the library of Cal Berkeley and what he was searching, we may find out that the story isn't how you use the adjective. It might be something a little bit more nefarious. And these are the kind of things that I think that the Wojcicki sisters and family and Sergey Brin really don't want out. Because guess what? Let me explain to you how tenuous the situation is.
Hmm.
If this story fully comes out and I'm correct about this after a new president comes in and gets a new attorney general, because remember, this is the key to this whole story that you need to understand. When you capture the executive branch, which is how I laid that case out with Danny very clearly, with George Kennan, with Wild Bill Donovan, and General Groves. When you understand that's where the capture is. Remember, who's part of the executive branch? It's the Attorney General. What is the Attorney General's main focus? They take care of the acute law. In other words, they can decide to let the criminals run free. They can also decide to let their political enemies be prosecuted.
Hmm.
That's exactly what the attorney generals have done since JFK till now. Okay. That's the reason why we have a criminal element both in Congress and the executive branch running free. The break that we still have intact is the Supreme Court. But that's the reason why Biden, the Clintons, Obama have wanted to stack the court. That's why Kamala's come out and said, we want to stack the court, because guess what? That's the last part of government that's not captured. Because
Hmm.
guess what that means? When we go and Fauci is brought up on charges, if the Supreme Court is stacked, it doesn't matter anyway, because guess what? He's going to get off just like every other white collar criminal gets off in this country. The key is that you have to have somebody doing the job of the people as the attorney general, because when you don't have freedom of the press anymore, which I think all of us know, we know about Project Mockingbird, and believe it or not,
Of course.
Mockingbird was exposed at the same time during the Church Commission. You know, of all the things I mentioned to Danny, you realize that the attorney general really is the proxy for free speech. And it's more than ironic that that is the position that Bobby Kennedy Sr. held in his brother's cabinet. And it's also the reason why he was taken out. partially because he did go after, Murder Inc. as
Yes.
the attorney general because he was not aware of what Joseph Kennedy promised Sam Giancana and Meyer Lansky at that time. And the other thing that got him really done is the industrial military complex realized in 68 that if he did run, many of the things that are in those archives, those people were all still alive at the time. Right now, the only person that's really alive at this time is Judith Very Baker. Now, there's certain people in the government that are, but you'll see their 2.0, 3.0, and 4.0 evolution. Most of those people are Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I don't think that we were able to dissect this too much with Danny because Danny didn't want to go down the big area, which
I noticed.
how the intelligence agencies are linked to this, and that story to me is the biggest piece of why you need to understand the story between fiat, Bitcoin, the industrial military complex, and politics as it stands today. And ironically, it also links to my big problem, which is healthcare.
Mhm.
Why? Because fiat is what's driving the destruction of healthcare because it supports the people that sit close to the money printer, which is big pharma.
Mhm.
Big pharma money has been used to actually eliminate the press. That's exactly what we learned in the Church Commission, but people never really understood how that process really happened and what the change occurred from 77 to say today. It used to be illegal for big pharma to put ads on TV. Well, the
Right.
executive branch, through changes through executive orders and Congress, made it okay to do that. See, the two captured branches allowed this to happen. And what did they do? They basically preconditioned all of us so that the media would not do its job. And when you control the media and you control the attorney general's office, basically there is no stop on the government. And today, most of you can realize why they're really going after Musk because he bought X and he's still a believer in free speech. But here's the irony. He's also an industrial military player.
Right. That's
But
where I have trouble understanding his position in all of this.
well, you shouldn't have trouble understanding it because I think when I tell you what I'm about to tell you, Musk is a true narcissist. And Musk realizes they need him more than he needs them. And that's the truth. And we just saw the proof of that when the astronauts were stranded up in space and he comes into the rescue. And then when you see his rockets come and fly back in, you realize that the next step of the Brain Health Initiative is to turn all this on from satellites above so they can do targeting. If you remember the Gulf War, which I'm sure you do remember as a young boy, you saw stealth bombers take laser guided bombs and go straight down elevator shaft to blow things up. Well, they're going to do the same thing with people with satellites above. If you want to know one of the nefarious things that DARPA can now do with Starlink, guess what? They're going to do it at industrial scale when SpaceX does what he does. That's when Musk becomes expendable to the industrial military complex. In other words, when you can train a cadre of people in the bureaucracy that they control to do what Musk does, Musk becomes superfluous to them.
Mhm.
But right now, Musk knows that he's not superfluous. In other words, he will not be taken out by the industrial military complex because he is still quite useful to them. And he knows that. But do I think he's narcissistic enough to think that he's immune? Yes, I do.
Mhm.
And that's part of his own pathology. But personally, me, I don't have a problem with that. I don't need to like anybody in order to see the bigger picture to put things together. The big thing is right now, he's actually on the side of we the people. Therefore, hitherto and moreover, I think I give him benefit of the doubt. I tell you the same thing about Trump. I'm not
Mhm.
a fan of Trump. I said it on Danny's podcast, but I was directed by Bobby and Nicole that, look, you need to vote for Trump. So I just came back from Florida yesterday. I
Mhm.
voted for Trump. Okay. And I'm not making any bones about it. Why? It's what I said again to Danny. I don't need to like my leaders. For some reason, there's a lot of people in the United States that somehow think you can't vote for somebody who you don't find abhorrent in certain parts, of their personality. I don't have a problem with that. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
Like, I try to give you a good example. Maybe in music, a really good one. Ozzy Osbourne.
Hmm.
That's probably a good one. I find his personal politics pretty disgusting, but I think he's one of the greatest musicians of this generation from 1970 probably to through Blizzard of Oz. Now he's a shadow of himself because of neurodegeneration and
Yeah.
all that. But that doesn't mean that I don't like Black Sabbath or Blizzard of Oz songs because the guy's a douchebag. No. I mean, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think part of our problem through the MKUltraing of screen technology,
Hmm.
we think that we all have to be compliant across the board. No, we don't. We can actually sit down and have a cogent discussion
Right.
and say, look, I really don't like this person. Um, but I'm willing to entertain this because if it makes sense for the greater good, because that's really what the game of politics is. And I think I laid my case out very strongly on the Danny Jones podcast where I said, look, I'm concerned about my country. I've told all of you there's a reason I'm in El Salvador. I don't feel like I'm safe in the United States.
Hmm.
So 4 years ago, I made a decision to come down here and do some of the things, that the Patriots were doing during the Revolutionary War. And why did I pick now? Because of what Becker told me in that meeting we had. He goes, "Do not drop your nuclear bomb at the wrong time because what will happen to you is what happened to me, and you will never have that tip of the spear to penetrate deeply into what these guys are doing." And Becker, as part of this story that I think you'll be interested in, he is the one who shared his intel of the military with me. In other words, I was able to fill in a lot of loose holes that I had. Why? Because remember, I told you got canceled in 79. So the things that I
What does a
learned,
cancellation even look like in that pre-technological age? Was he,
well, it was
not allowed to
simple.
practice anymore? What
No, he
did that
could
look like?
practice, but remember his identity as a physician, because this is very, very different than it is today. He was just an MD, wasn't a PhD. He actually was so good at his job, he made the PhDs at his facility look sorry. He produced more high quality work doing it his way, not the way of centralized science.
Hmm.
Uh, he pissed off the people at his own hospital. Remember, he worked in a military hospital, the VA of Syracuse. And he went from a bottom rung guy. And remember, if you're an orthopedic surgeon in the 1950s and you take a job at a VA, all doctors in the 1950s will look at you as you're a piece of shit. You just took a low paying job with no future. Why would you do that when you could have been Marcus Welby and made millions of dollars, on the street? That's the kind of guy Becker was because he really wanted to find the truth out about some of the people who stimulated his mind to go to medical school. That main guy was Albert St. George. And then it turned out there was another guy named Burr, who was an anatomist that was at Yale, who actually found this DC electric current in plants. So the two ideas that started Becker down his path was, is there a DC electric current in mammals and in animals like there is in plants? And then St. George gave him the idea, every time I look at proteins, they look like they're semiconductors. They have semiconductive properties. This is radical because in 1950s, when Becker is beginning, remember, transistors are just literally founded in Silicon Valley. Like no one knew anything about this. This was the area where we're transitioning from vacuum tubes to transistors. So when I tell you that this guy is literally light years ahead of where centralized science was at the time, he was, and he was singular focus on proving that there was some type of mechanism, like what he called the growth control system, in animals. And don't you think literally within 15 years in the VA, why was this good? Because he was in a small place, didn't have to compete with any of the idiots that are in centralized science. And this is the part that infuriated his boss. He actually was so good and did so many cool experiments. He was publishing in huge journals at the time, like Science, the Lancet, and this guy was a no name, like an absolute no name. But what he was studying was the tip of the spear of what is the most important thing in medicine. But everybody didn't know what he was doing. Very few people knew exactly what he was doing. And one of those people, unfortunately, that figured it out was the industrial military complex. Mm-hmm. That was the bad thing. So how do you get canceled in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s? When you have a lab, and this lab is like the biggest thing in this hospital, and the money spigot gets turned off in 2 weeks, dude, that's it. You lose your space, the lights are turned off, all the fancy equipment you have, it's gone. You can't pay any of the people that work for you. And remember, this guy's twice nominated for the Nobel Prize. In fact, he won the Michelson Award given by the military to the best lab in the VA system in the whole country. He won it. That's how decorated this guy was. And because he went on 60 Minutes and told the world the truth that electromagnetic pollution is the big reason behind chronic disease epidemics, dude, that was not what anybody wanted him to do. Why? Because the military was moving from an industrial revolution to an information technology revolution, which used semiconduction and light and all the things they were learning about in MKUltra and putting it at a global scale so that they could control people to do the things they wanted. And they were getting ready, you know, literally 20 years later. That's when Sergey Brin and Larry Page are given, you know, the evolution of MKUltra, because that's really the step between MKUltra and the Brain Health Initiative.
Okay.
Google algorithm is the key to the story. Why? Because it's not only, it links not only screen technology, but it links surveillance in one single dose. And when you begin to realize how they're using this and hijacking the reward pathways and how they're uncoupling the basics of our biology, like, let me explain the little bit of science to you that I will in this podcast so you understand how important it is. What did Becker really find? This DC electric current in us, it takes red blood cells and de-differentiates them into stem cells. Now, you guys believe today, even right now, that stem cells are like in us and then they magically show up and replace things in our body. It turns out that's not how it happens at all. This is the reason why guys that are giving you stem cells are the biggest fucking scammers on the planet. They don't know what Becker's work is. Why is the red blood cell the key to this story? Because it has no mitochondria. That means there's no electric potential in a red blood cell. Why is that a key part of this story? Because Becker found that the current to de-differentiate red blood cells is 1,000 of 1 million of an ampere of current, meaning it is the most fucking small thing in the world you could ever imagine. And the biochemical paradigm that still exists today, this is in the 1960s, he finds this. They couldn't fucking wrap their head around this. So what was Becker's next logical extension? Well, if a small little current does this in our body, what does this mean for all the things that are plugged into the AC power grid? How is that impacting our ability to heal? How is that impacting diabetes? How is that impacting limb regeneration or bone regeneration? Like, he was asking the biggest questions that you now hear guys like Bobby Kennedy talk about. Well, dude, this is what I've been talking about for 20 years. I kept my focus in on his work. So when you begin to realize why darkness at night's a big deal, as soon as you put a light on, that changes the voltages and the currents tremendously in your body. So you literally looking at a screen ruins that DC current for regeneration at night. Like game, set, and match. It's over. based on Becker's work. But what also does it mean? It means when we have sunlight, like you see behind me, this is how you recharge the battery. Now, what didn't Becker find in all his work up until 79? What the source of the issue was. Remember, he took it from electrical current to regeneration. So what did Jack do? Jack said, okay, what is it below nerves, which is the myelin level, inside a cell that actually creates a pile of electrons? And I found a gene in us called POMC. I talked for 10 hours to Rick and Huberman on the Tetragrammaton podcast about that. That was really what I went to talk to Becker about the science part. And I told him that light from the sun actually creates a pile of electrons that makes the DC electric current. That was the unfinished part of his work that he never got to. So when you begin to realize that technology, what is the goal? I told the story of Meyer Lansky and Mo Dalitz and how they fixed the Flamingo Casino by blocking out, sunlight, closing everything up. You'll start to realize that, Jesus, this is the same kind of story of what technology does to us today. It brings us inside. I mean, this podcast that you and I are doing is a perfect example of this. You're inside and I'm outside. Okay. Technology has a trend to keep us indoors and not outside. I would say to you, even in your primary industry, remember back in the day, most musicians used to do their concerts during the day because there was no artificial light. Well, that all changed after artificial light came. And what happens? Even, believe it or not, the biggest music festival in the world, which was Woodstock, most of the best acts occurred when? During the day, not at night. And the irony is in 69, when this happens, Jimi Hendrix shows up late at night and literally a year later, he's dead. You have to realize that this story is present. You think about all the people in rock and roll who've been taken out. What have they all been taken out from? Because their job fundamentally breaks the basic law that Becker found in his work. So he brought this to everybody's attention. So when we sat down and he explained to me, he goes, you need to be careful about how you deliver this story. Why? Because it turns out no one cares about the science. He goes, people who are sick will care about the science. He goes, but the people who are really going to care about your message when you deliver it are going to be the industrial military complex, because those are the guys that are weaponizing it. And he goes, now I understand why I was canceled. And that's when we jumped down what he found in the military. Why? Because I told you he worked in a VA. So he had a lot of connections, especially with the U.S. Navy, especially with the Joint Chiefs, especially high-level people. I mean, you go back and read the book that his PhD researcher that worked in his lab, his name's Andrew Marino, it's called Going Somewhere. When you read the congressional testimony of Becker and Marino from 1977 through 1973, 73 through 77, dude, your eyeballs will explode. You will not believe the things that Becker and Marino found. They found literally that a light bulb in their office could affect the Earth's magnetosphere 80,000 kilometers above the surface. Becker went to MIT and sat down with a bunch of electrical engineers and said, you guys seem to understand that magnetic fields affect semiconductors. Why is it so hard for you to believe that magnetic fields would affect biology? He goes, we have great data in goldfish. He actually brought this up to them. And you know what the problem with the electrical engineers was? They couldn't fathom that small little magnetic fields could do this, because guess what they didn't understand? They didn't understand that 1,000th of a millionth of current dedifferentiated red blood cells. That is the issue. And remember what I said to you in the beginning of our podcast. It's the mark of an educated mind to take something you physically do not believe or understand and examine it for yourself. If you want to know the truth, that's what Becker was trying to get everybody to do. But nobody wanted to do that. And the industrial military complex that was running their war games certainly wasn't going to let anybody go down there. And how did they do that? They controlled the funding of the NIH. So they made sure that nobody studied this. And Becker, through all of his work, kept saying, it's amazing to me that these Russians are doing all this work, but we're not doing any of this work in the United States. Well, guess what? Because the Russians didn't have a shadow government inside of their government. Okay. They weren't trying to stunt things. That's also the reason why the Russians got to space before us. And just realize, how did Becker link all this for me? He said, Jack, in 1955 through 57, he goes, when Sputnik went up, he goes, you know what the big benefit for me was? He goes, I got to have the US government translate all these things from Russian, and it would show up to the Syracuse VA, and I got to read. And he said to me, he goes, I saw that scientists were asking about DC electric currents in animals in Russia when no one in the United States was doing it. And I said, so that's how you found out about it? Yeah. And then he gave me the idea. He said, I think since you're interested in this biophoton research, he goes, I think you need to do the same thing. So, bro, guess what I did? That's exactly what I did. I translated almost $100,000 worth of these papers, and I found that his inclination was exactly correct. So I knew I was down the right path, but then I think the links that he gave me and explained to me what was going on with General Groves outside, explaining to me what was going on with Eisenhower at that time, explaining to me, because remember, he lived through this as a young man. He had from 1979 to 2007 to put all this together. He thought about this for a really long time. And you can imagine this guy was heterodox to begin with, so you know that he wanted to prove a lot of motherfuckers wrong. But I'm sad to say that the industrial military complex broke his will. And when I showed up, I gave him the scientific satisfaction to show that he was right. But I told him, I said, I'm not done with the other part of this story. I'm going to prove these motherfuckers wrong. And he said, well, you be careful about this.
I've got a question. Prior to Becker's work, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they thought that they had to have a direct connection, a direct current to
Correct.
Cause any, like Jose Delgado working with the bulls and implants and stuff.
Right.
Why
You got that story, but remember what I told you. What was Becker's mistake? That's the same mistake that the CIA made. They started with electricity, no one actually got the idea. Well, where'd the electricity come from? It came from light. Guess what? The CIA got that information before Becker ever did.
So were they trying to shut down his research so that they could co-opt it? They wanted to use it for,
they wanted to find out
bad?
exactly how much he knew. They wanted to find out, was this guy dangerous for us? And here's the irony. The irony is he turned out to be dangerous for them, but not in the way that they thought. Because he realized that all the stuff that we were putting into the environment at this time was a huge problem for this current. Like that's what led to almost all the diseases. And to give the U.S. Navy a benefit, you very rarely will you hear me give the military, the benefit of the doubt. But I will tell you, one of the good things that the military did support him initially was because his idea on limb regeneration is that you could get away from cybernetics, of replacing things like you see now that Elon Musk is trying to do. Becker believed that once we understood the science of the growth control mechanism, we could actually regenerate limbs. And to be honest with you, I do believe he's still right to this day. But again, why don't we have this? All this research was stunted because he was canceled. The only guy that's studying this stuff right now is a guy named Michael Levin at Tufts University. But Michael Levin is also heavily tied to funding from the NIH. So guess what? He also was impacted by Becker's research, but he's not going to say some of the things that I'm saying because guess what? His whole career is based on his funding. See, I'm not. See, that's what makes me Becker, right. That's what makes me and Becker kind of interesting. Like Becker was a centralized guy because of his funding. There was no decentralized idea, but the thing that Becker realized is that the growth control mechanism in us was fully decentralized. Like he knew it. And dude, he had a singular focus of doing the most crazy experiments to prove that he was right. In fact, when you read Marino's account, who's a true scientist, he goes, I don't understand how he knew he was right. But it turns out every time he did an experiment, he was right. And this is the irony that I've had to discuss with both Bobby and Nicole. I said, look, when you understand how the decentralized network in a cell works, you don't fucking study things the way a biochemist does. In fact, that was the whole idea that I brought to Huberman and Rick in the Tetragrammaton podcast when I talked about POMC and where the DC electric current comes from. Like, the whole scientific method thing, dude, it's flawed. It's flawed in a really big way. And Becker is the one guy that's actually exposed this. Do I think other people have exposed it as well? Albert St. George exposed it. I think even Rupert Sheldrake has exposed it. And the problem is when you stay 100% tied to the scientific method, where does it end up? It actually ends up with Ray Kurzweil and Sergey Brin. You wind up with OpenAI. And that's the most dangerous thing you could ever imagine. And that's why all the transhumanists are behind it, because what does centralized AI really do? It allows you to centralize everything, including your thinking. So what happens? That means you whitewash everything that could be the truth. And that's effectively what's going on right now in our country. That I told somebody this yesterday, that I believe if Kamala wins, that 10 years from now, even though you live through it, you'll find no evidence of what happened during COVID at all. The true story of what's developing with SV40.
Oh, it's already been pretty successfully scrubbed. I mean, it's hard to find legitimate,
And that's why I'm saying to you that OpenAI is going to make this even worse. And that's the reason why Musk is such a danger to them, because he has a platform that acts as the town square where guys like me and you can get on it and discuss ideas like this, why it's important, never to take human thinking out of it, because AI can never replace what we are capable of doing. That is the pipe dream of guys like Kurzweil, and I would even say Musk and Sergey Brin. That is their Dunning-Kruger moment.
Speaking of no, sorry, go ahead, Jack.
No, I was just going to say, that's why we need to stop this whole process.
Yeah. And, you brought up Sergey Brin again, and just the whole topic of transhumanism. I don't think people fully understand, just what small gaps are like Sergey Brin, you can look back the early 2000s. There are articles about them having dinner parties and like advisory committees with Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and the Wojcicki's, I think Ann's the one who owns 23andMe. And that's
Correct.
just, one degree of separation between Epstein, who's famously was very interested in eugenics, And another thing I don't think people realize is that the Maxwell sisters, Ghislaine and Christine Maxwell, pre-Google, they owned this kind of startup company called Magellan that was essentially the same thing as Google, this centralized data, whatever you want to call it. So I find that really interesting because, I mean, there's links, you can trace them back, Julian Huxley, who kind of was the, credited with founding the term of transhumanism. He was also, the whole Huxley family was very big into eugenics as well, from what I understand.
Right. And you realize on the other side where they've tried to scrape things is Margaret Sanger, who is, big with the Clintons. Planned Parenthood, what is its real goal? It's to wipe out black babies. It's been extremely successful. Why?
She said that verbatim. There's a quote of hers where she says our main goal is to exterminate the black family.
Correct. And you have to realize that Hillary Rodham Clinton is on record saying she admires, this person. And here's the irony. You heard me say something a little bit to Danny. When I told you that Pope Pius the 12th really had a hand with the royal family in exterminating 4 million Jews, what if I was to tell you that Oprah Winfrey, Obama, and Michelle Obama have played the same role for black population?
Yeah.
And the irony is, I don't think black people really understand how bad they've been played. But the interesting thing is, I think COVID has woken up enough black people, enough brown people, and they're starting to realize that white people with skin are just the same as they are. We're all economic slaves in this big story. And that's why I try to get Danny to understand that this story really isn't just a hell story, a control story. It funnels right back to money. And you need to understand how money plays the role. That's actually what Sergei's, I think God is. He wants ultimate control. I mean, he's trying to take Echo away from Nicole right now, not because he cares about Echo. He could give two fucks about Echo. But it's teaching Nicole a lesson that you don't fuck with, the top dog in Silicon Valley. Well, I got news for you. And I said this to Nicole. I said, just remember the top dog in Hollywood used to be Harvey Weinstein. And we know that Michelle Obama and Oprah used to pal around with him and had such great things to say about him. Nobody thought that Weinstein could be taken down, and he was. And it turned out, what took him down? Propaganda. It turned out the Me Too movement turned out to be pretty successful. And this is something that none of them saw coming. And I'm going to tell you the same thing is going to happen with big tech. Like when people really wake up and the narrative is flipped, that's the reason why I thought Elon Musk's talk with Tucker Carlson was very interesting, because what Musk is saying is these people, the only thing that they're really afraid of is that list coming out. And once that list comes out, guess what? Their positions in power immediately go away, because we saw that's exactly what happened to Weinstein. Weinstein lost everything. Also, look at Epstein. Epstein lost everything. Look what happened with Maxwell. She lost everything.
Diddy now is going through the same thing.
Correct. Well, they're all part of the same, tentacle of the octopus.
Right.
The big tentacle, though, that has to fall is the political one. Why? Because the political one, when you understand who's playing ball with these people, that explains the reason why you and I are living in the times that we're living. It explains to you why I feel I need to be in El Salvador. And it probably explains why, you have to do certain things that you had to do through COVID. And I'm going to tell you that I really believe that just the disinfected of sunlight on this story is enough. And do I think the propaganda is enough to take these people out? Yeah, I'm going to tell you that Napoleon Bonaparte was brilliant in his diagnosis, of this thing. Public opinion really is a thermometer of what a monarch should constantly be made aware of. And that kind of whole thing is what drove the French Revolution and why the king in France went down. That is very operational to actually what happened in the royal family in World War I. They changed their name from Saxe, Bertha, and Gotha to Windsor. Well, guess what? They got the message that Napoleon was trying to deliver. And I'm telling you that right now, I believe the same vulnerability is present in big tech, in OpenAI, in the DNC. I think each one of them carry a risk. And to be honest with you, when I talk about this, because most of the stuff that I'm talking about here really isn't the health stuff. When you understand how these things are linked and you understand who these people are tied to and how they go back to the control of the executive and legislative branch. I mean, look, Chuck Schumer's on record saying when Trump was running in 2015, 2016, he's like, look, if Trump continues to act like this, he doesn't seem to fucking understand that the industrial military complex is going to take him out. This is the guy that is the leader of the Senate. He's actually admitting that they're captured. We all know that the Warren Commission is what captured Congress. They've been captured ever since then. And if you do enough homework, it's kind of like I try to tell Danny that as a neurosurgeon, I'm a pretty good diagnostician. I take things apart and put it together so you can see it for yourself. You can go back and look at what Schumer says when he was interviewed about this issue. That clip is still out there, going around. There's so many things that these people have all said that Now it's not, they're not even lying to you. I mean, you
Yeah.
heard what Kamala said. We're going to get rid of the First Amendment. We're coming after your guns, and we're also going to stock the court. We don't think that Elon Musk should be able to say the things that he's saying. We don't think people should be able to say that. And then what's the real come to Jesus moment? Literally the day before I go on Danny Jones, um, we get the ability of the military to shoot us if
Yeah.
we fucking say anything. I'm
Right.
like, are you fucking kidding me? I mean, dude, how 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 much data do you need to be woken up as a savage? And that's why, I made no apologies in that fucking podcast. I said, look, I'm not here to make you fucking feel good. I'm
Mhm.
here to wake the fucking savages up because we need to take the country back.
Well, that's why
These
I think all this is so important is because if you took away the operations that they did in the 50s and the 60s and introducing MKUltra and drugs and the different mind control apparatuses that they have, I don't believe we'd be in the state that we're in because people are too complacent and comfortable and distracted that they're not willing to get up and do what it takes and take things to the town square like it would have been done in the old days. Like you said on Danny Jones' podcast, you said there are people in Congress that should be executed for treason, and I agree that you're 100% correct. And
Oh, no
another
doubt.
thing that you say that I like,
Eric
you're
Swalwell,
yeah.
California, sleeping with a Chinese spy. To me, that's treason. Sorry,
hmm
bro.
hmm
I think Nancy Pelosi, just her stock trading, she's clearly an insider trader.
What about
Everybody
APAC and the lobbying power that they have?
don't even go there. I mean, the only reason that's really a story now is because Thomas Massey is the one guy in Congress that
Right.
doesn't have an APAC rep. But even when Danny didn't want to go down the whole story with Newmac and Pennsylvania, and why is Pennsylvania always part of this story? Because it's the most fucking corrupt state in the union. It goes
hmm
back to Arlen Specter. It goes
hmm
all the way back there. But people don't want to see that where the Mossad got the fissionable uranium is fucking from Pennsylvania.
hmm hmm
And what happens? Gerald Ford's attorney general, again, we're back to that story, Edward Levi, who holds dual citizenship between Israel and
Yep.
the United States,
Yep.
says we're just going to turn a blind eye to that. And he was also the attorney general when Carter comes in. And what does he do? He doesn't tell Carter the full story that the FBI had the mark. And
Yeah.
you sit there and you go, dude, remember what I said? Captured executive branch. That this story, it goes so far back. But you know what the problem is? I'm impressed by you as a young musician where you've done your deep dive in the history and you understand this. But how many people are going to listen to this podcast and don't know
hmm
the history of this country and how these things all link together?
Well, I want to dive into that. And before that, I just want to say, I think that what you're saying there is like exactly right. I know you have your phrase, about history and fiction. The difference is that fiction has to make sense. Well, one of my favorite researchers who I've spoken to a couple times, Joe Atwill, he puts it this way. He says, um, he's never known anybody who, a person who kind of just believed the mainstream narratives and lived their lives like that, kind of with the blinders on. He said he's never known anybody who started to go down the other route and learn about true history and then went back to how they were before. You create this framework that makes sense. And then the one that was given to you and provided before, it will never make sense again. Once you establish this framework of history that actually makes everything make sense from the 60s, MKUltra to JFK to 9/11 to COVID to all these different things to the incoming economic reset that we're going to see soon. But I think an important thing to do is there's so much to digest. And just like you said a few minutes ago, the average person listening to these types of things, it's so much. So to me, I think it's really important to take different important events and really talk about it so that you can make it fit into this logical framework. And you kind of were hinting at one of them that I think is really important for people to understand, which is the JFK assassination and what that was really about and who those players really were, like the B'nai B'rith and different things like that, and Sam Bloom and Julia Sheps and these different people that really orchestrated that man's death. all the way to Abraham Zapruder and the FBI. They found their ballistic studies showed that the first shots came from a textile building that was owned by David Weisblatt of B'nai B'rith and one of the original funders of the ADL, and Douglas Jaffe, who was the largest donor to the LBJ campaign, who obviously took over as president after he was killed. And even Zapruder himself, Abraham Zapruder, was a member of the B'nai B'rith, the Dallas B'nai B'rith. So that story in itself, I
Not only
mean,
that, but Zapruder, we know the film that Oliver. Yeah, the film when it was first shown in the trial in New Orleans, that
mhm,
film was already doctored,
right.
and we now know that forensically. The one that was shown in the JFK movie also doctored, to get the narrative that is present. We also we know a lot more about this, but I think the original story that I tried to really give Danny was you need to understand where B'nai B'rith comes in.
He was
B'nai
very
B'rith
resistant when you
is
brought
an
up the.
order that started off. Yeah. Well, I understand why, because guess what? When you put this on YouTube, the people that
Mhm,
control YouTube,
mhm,
these are all people that are linked, to these same societies.
mhm,
And you need to realize that B'nai B'rith started at Saxe Coburg and Gotha,
mhm,
and these people were ostracized in Germany at that time. They come over to the United States, but they're always remain loyal to the crown. So when Queen Victoria takes over in 1837, she's still trying to recapture what King George lost, which is the United States. So what does all these B'nai B'rith people do? They get involved in business and they get involved in banking in the United States. They become very successful in the United States. They basically foment the North and South narrative, the Civil War. Why?
mhm,
Because the belief of those who are loyal to the crown that if you have a war like this and you divide them, we may be able to come back in and conquer them. And it turned out that not only was that not successful, the only thing it was really successful at is creating probably a huge break between blacks and whites in the United States that has lasted up to this very day. But we've got several amendments still linked to Civil War times,
mhm,
that had to come out. But I think the number one thing that people need to realize, the people that were behind the assassination of Kennedy, I should say, were the same ones that were behind the people that killed Lincoln. Like
mhm,
we have three presidents killed:
mhm,
McKinley, uh, Lincoln, and Kennedy in assassination attempts. All three, uh, the B'nai B'rith leadership is behind. So
mhm,
when people think this is a story about Israel, like I have a huge problem with that because it's not.
mhm,
And people have to realize you have to separate Jews from the Zionist Federation. The
right,
B'nai B'rith people become the Zionist Federation that is popular during World War One.
right.
Those are the people that tried to overthrow the U.S. government with the Civil War. Those are the people that killed Lincoln. In fact, what they wound up doing, they made the situation for Queen Victoria worse because the United States became very strong from the Civil War, through World War One, and nothing was proven more true when you see how the Treaty of Versailles wins.
Right.
And I try to make this point several times in several podcasts that I've done since then that no country has won two world wars and lost more than Britain. Why? Because the royal family, in my opinion, with the Rothschild bankers, they made a deal with the devil at the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles really is when you get the Rothschild bankers in bed with the Harriman brothers, with Rockefeller, with Carnegie Mellon. In other words, all these huge banking families come together and they get control of the monetary system of the United States. But it's still the monarchy that thinks that these people are working for them. And that's
Mhm,
really not the case. They're working in unison for them because the royal family really is useful idiots for the people that are in the banking community. And I got taught this lesson as a 15-year-old by Theodore Silbert, who's what? He's a card carrying member of B'nai B'rith. And he
mhm,
explained to me how B'nai B'rith thinks about money, how they think about connections. He's the person that taught me about the Battle of Waterloo and Nathan Rothschild and how they wrestled power uh, from the royal family. And that's when I found out it was the gold smugglers that were the key, because they were the internet of the time. And Nathan Rothschild got the message early before anybody else in London did when trading started. And what did he do? He used simple propaganda. He actually pulled out Edward Bernays in 1812 before Edward Bernays is coming 110 years later.
Mm-hmm.
He goes in there, mopes around, and starts selling all the king's bonds. And
Mm-hmm.
everybody thinks, oh, fuck, we lost the Battle of Waterloo. Turns out they didn't. Literally, at the end of the day, he buys everything back at pennies on the dollar, and everybody realized they got fucking hoodwinked.
And the
Dude, that's
grandfather
truly
of propaganda, Bernays, doesn't. I'm pretty sure one of his descendants is who owns Netflix and lots of other of these.
right. Oh, you know where Bernays? You know who Bernays' mother is linked to is Freud, Sigmund
Oh
Freud.
wow, wow.
Martha is the mother, and who is the child of Edward Bernays? You may not know this. Anna Freud.
Okay.
She's the psychiatrist that's involved. Guess with who? Marilyn Monroe, who's tied to Bobby Kennedy
JFK.
Sr., JFK.
And
Dude,
MKUltra also.
right. You cannot make this fucking shit up.
What
And,
about Tavistock? How does Tavistock and Theodore Adorno, does that fit in with the
yeah, I
same
mean,
kind of group of people?
I mentioned Tavistock. Tavistock is linked to the Bilderberg organization.
Hmm.
It's where the Bilderberg, it's where the banking and the intelligence system in the UK come together.
Okay.
See, that's their story of the Grove story for us in the Manhattan Project.
Hmm.
Tavistock really happens in 1921. That's when they become fully operational. Why does that story become important? Because literally about 20 years later, that's where Alan Turing comes into play.
Hmm.
Alan Turing,
Isn't he connected to Skull and Bones?
well, not Skull and Bones is the Yale stuff.
Yeah.
Tavistock is tied to that, but Turing is not part of that. Turing is actually a good guy in this story
Okay.
who goes bad because he's an idiot savant in mathematics and comes up with the use of cryptography in the war. And the Rothschild bankers, the popes, and the royal family realized this was a good way to get information from them to the Nazis without anybody knowing what's going on. The history books say that Turing actually helped them break the Enigma codes, but we know that's total bullshit. Why? Because Turing got taken out just the same way Lee Harvey Oswald did.
Hmm.
And if he was such a great guy, why did the British government do what they did to him? Why? Because he knew too much.
Hmm.
And he couldn't stay around, and they took him out. He was done in 51 and 52 when, ironically, what did they use? They used puberty blocking drugs on him. Sound
Wow.
eerily familiar to what's going on now?
Tavistock nowadays, if you go to their website, the big thing that Tavistock is into now is transgenderism.
Right. And that's
So,
the reason why I mention it to you here, because people think this transgenderism is a new idea. It's not a new idea. That's actually how they took Turing out. They actually chemically castrated him.
Oh wow.
And then here's the irony. Do you know how Steve Jobs gets the name Apple? You know how he killed?
I don't think so.
Well, they say he killed himself, but I believe it was MI6 that did it.
Hmm.
He ate a poisonous apple. And that is how Apple got its name.
Wow. I always thought it was maybe a Garden of Eden
No,
reference, Tree of Knowledge of Good and Evil or something.
everybody thinks that, but it's not true. It actually some Turing. And remember, what is Jobs? Jobs is a guy that comes up and really manufactures computers. He does a way better job than anybody else. Everybody considers him the father of computing, but Jobs always looked at Turing as the real, beginning of it, and because he came up with the Turing test and all that.
Talking about Tavistock and transgenderism, doesn't a lot of that also go back to Magnus Hirschfeld pretty significantly?
Yeah. I mean, look, all these things have deep, deep, deep ties. And the problem is, I don't think the transgenderism is one of those things that we really need to go back to the basics with, because the basics that you're bringing up now is when they realized drugs would do it. But when was the real magical moment? is within MKUltra when they realized that light can change the hormone panel. They said, wait a minute, we don't need to use drugs. We can actually use light to do this. And that's effectively what's happened to the nth degree in the last 20 years. In fact, I look at the architect of truly all of this, meaning the actionable part, as is Obama and Biden. Why? Because they changed the analog to digital signal in Obama's first term
with LCD
right
screens and things like that.
exactly. And then when they decided to cancel light bulbs, and they did it under the moniker that you hear from the World Economic Forum, oh, we need to do it to save energy for the CO2 footprint.
Yeah.
That is total bullshit. Turns out that those lights are the biggest endocrine disruptors out there. And, when you hear people like Bobby Kennedy and the Means brother and sister talk the shit they talk, it drives me fucking crazy.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I get crazy about it, you blame fucking food for what light causes. You never solve the original fucking problem.
Right. Right.
And that is my problem with them. And here's the irony. All these forever chemicals, none of them realize that the answer is already in centralized science. There's a guy named Moreau that won the Nobel Prize for something called chirp frequencies, that you can actually take really strong light, monochromatic light, and you can get rid of fucking forever chemicals. So guess what? If you want to talk about that shit, great. We already know how to fix it. But guess what fixes it again? Fucking light. We're back to the light story. And it needs to stay on the light story, and it doesn't need to go to the food story. The food story is fucking superfluous. And it drives me fucking crazy when people want to talk about it, because the one thing that is very crystal clear, nobody in MKUltra and nobody in the Brain Health Initiative is using food to fucking change people,
right.
In the way they think. Yeah, it does make you sick, but it's not the fucking key story. And the fact that these means people show up with Bobby leads me to believe that this is another psyops from big tobacco, big food. Because guess what? We've had many people. I mean, shit, we had Atkins saying this in the beginning, that, food was a big deal. We all fucking know the food in the United States is a problem, but it's not the magnitude of the problem that these people want to believe. And when they're pushed this narrative, dude, it makes me really crazy. And then when you see the link of this brother and sister tandem to the same universities that are tied to this story at ARPANET and MKUltra, and you find out she didn't finish her residency. They give you this bullshit story about, how their mother died and their father, did this and did that. And then you find out he's written a transgender book about a flamingo named Felix. You start to go, bro. And then it comes back to what we just talked about, the Tavistock stuff. Look, you need to put pieces together. I'm just going to tell you that I don't believe that we fix these problems until we focus our laser beam on the real problem. The real problem is the aberrant use of light to change not all our hormone panels, but also the way our orbital frontal gyri and frontal lobes work. That is the key.
And you're talking about dopamine reward structures there, right?
Absolutely. It's not just dopamine. It's really the basics are the melanin pathway. Why? Because when you break down dopamine, you eventually break down melanin. What is the reason for that? This is where, unfortunately, you probably don't want to go, but this is where the science goes. We need dopamine and melatonin to actually regenerate the photoreceptors that are in us. So why does this go back to the light story? I just pointed out to you. If you don't have optimized dopamine and melatonin, you can't fix the non-visual photoreceptors, meaning that is really what MKUltra truly found. And we now know that. That's published in the literature. The craziest part of the story, who clued me into this, was Becker, when he said to me in 2007, he said, did you see who Tony Fauci and the government just put in to the National Institutes of Drug Abuse? And I'm like, no, who's that? He goes, Nora Volkow. He goes, you know who she is? She's the granddaughter of Trotsky. I said, you got to be fucking kidding me.
Jesus
and
Christ.
He's linked to Jolly West, which is the guy that was with Jack Ruby, the guy that Danny wanted to talk to, but he had no earthly idea about this link. And what is she? She's also a Trotskyite. She's an academic. She's at NYU and she's a psychiatrist.
What's her link to Jolly West? I might have missed what you said there.
MKUltra. Jolly
Okay.
West was a psychiatrist also employed in the
Oh,
MKUltra
I'm
program.
fully aware of Jolly West's history. I just meant her connection to him specifically.
Connection is through the same program. The
Okay.
difference was Volkow was the one that published the first link between non-native EMF increasing blood glucose and insulin.
Okay.
In other words, we now know definitively what the issue is. She's the one out there making sure that nobody but her is studying all of this stuff.
Hmm.
And who controls the funding of this? Tony Fauci.
NIH, NIMH, same people that funded MK Ultra back in the 60s and 70s.
Bro, you
Uh,
can't make
while Well, I know you can't. I know. While we're on Jolly West and that type of, that segment of MK Ultra, a guy that I wanted to ask you more about is Kurt Plotkin, who did some experimentation with mescaline, and I think he had MK Ultra funding, if I'm not mistaken.
well, no,
Um,
he had better funding than even that.
mhm.
He had Groves funding. And it's a very interesting story that I didn't get to. I think I talked to the guy Aiden D'Amico about it from from his podcast that I did after Danny, but I'll explain to
Okay.
you when this guy gets found. How does he get found? This is a really important part of the story. So you remember the Manhattan Project is how we come up with the atomic bomb. So I got to give
Hmm.
you a little background so you see where the pieces fit.
Hmm.
Why is it called the Manhattan Project? Do you know?
Not sure.
Yeah, most people don't know this because it turns out it started in the 67th floor of the Empire State Building. That's actually where Groves is giving the commission once they get rid of Albert Compton of Compton Scattering.
Okay.
Groves hires Oppenheimer, and it's based there. And where they're putting together their plan, they decide Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanover, Washington is where they're going to do two parts of the story. The third part is they're going to build the factories out in Los Alamos. So that's where the ideas come from. Well, guess what happens? Uh, this is before the CIA is operational. It's ONI and OSS
Right.
get information that the Nazis are bringing U-boats into New York Harbor, and there's now spies in New York because they now know that in 1939, Einstein wrote this letter to FDR, and they want to know what's going on at that time.
Hmm.
So, if you know anything about this time in America, it's right before we get into the war that this shit's going on.
Is this before the National Security Act that moved
Oh yeah,
OSS to CIA?
dude, this is like literally 7-8 years before it. That's why
Okay.
this is important. So what happens, and when you hear how this links, your mind's gonna get blown. So December 6th, 1941 happens. We get drawn into the war. What was Churchill trying to do this whole time? Draw us into the war before we get in. But FDR, to his credit, did not want to get dragged into this shit. But who was selling bullets to both sides? The bankers,
Mhm.
including the Ford family, the JP Morgan.
Rothschilds.
They're doing all of this with the Nazis. They're funding both sides of this war. And that's where the Bush family gets involved because Prescott Bush is running Harriman Brown, which is one of the families that's linked to the Federal Reserve. They hide a lot of assets for the Nazis at this time. So when this story happens and breaks, FDR turns around to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We had just went through the Battle of Midway, and we lost most of our Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor.
Hmm.
You win that, but there's not a lot of deployment that they can put into New York Harbor. So what does General Groves say to FDR? He said, we may not have the manpower to parole the docks. He goes, but I think I know who might be able to help us. So he tells FDR, he goes, let's bring in Meyer Lansky. Murder Inc. controls the docks all in New York Harbor. And since the Manhattan Project is being formulated right at this time, this is 1941, 1942.
Hmm.
So they bring Lansky in and they ask Lansky, look, we know that you control the docks through the longshoremen and everything else. Would you want to be part of our effort here? This is what we need. We just need you to patrol the docks. And if you find anybody coming off U-boats or coming in through your docks, you turn them over to us so we can find out what's going on. And Lansky turns around to the executive branch and says, fine, I can do this for you, but you have to do something for me. So what's the proof that this goes down? He says, my best friend, Lucky Luciano, who controls the Capone crime family, he's now the boss. He's with Sam Giancana and all that jazz. He says he's in a maximum security prison right now. He goes, you put him in a minimum security prison so that he can run our businesses and I'll help you out. Dude, they cut the fucking deal. Now you can go today and look to see when this happens. You'll see when he's transferred. So how good when you make a deal with the devil, and the reason why they made a deal with the devil at this time was very simple. We were in a very tenuous position in 1942, 1943. Why? The war wasn't going well for us. And they were very concerned that the most secretive, huge engineering project could be found out by the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
Meyer Lansky is so freaking successful. He finds 19 U-boat spies. And guess who's the only guy they don't kill? The guy you just asked me about, the doctor.
Really? Wow.
Correct.
Plotkin. Wow.
And guess what? That guy gets turned over to the OSS and ONI, but what does Lansky do? This is before the Mossad's the Mossad,
mm-hmm.
Okay? But he tells the Jews that are part of this whole thing, hey, this is what's going on. And what does Lansky hear from this guy? He hears that they're using mescaline, they're using LSD, and they're doing other things like the use of fluoride
mm-hmm.
to keep these people docile before they kill them.
Mm-hmm.
You also hear stories that contradict the stories of the time. Like he tells them that they're not gassing these people. And he goes, the scale of the final solution isn't what you think.
Mm-hmm.
He goes, and he also found out, Meyer Lansky did, and this is when Meyer Lansky, his whole modus operandi changes. Lansky finds out that the Rothschilds are part of this Holocaust. In other words, this information goes not only to Lansky, but to Gross. Gross finds out that the royal family, the papacy, and the Rothschilds are part of this whole thing to try to get the United States back.
Right.
So guess what happens? This is
also
when,
real quick on that, weren't the Rothschilds funneling money through IG Farben, who was this Swiss pharmaceutical who made LSD and the
not only that, but
remember
what Farben is really famous for, mustard gas in World War I.
Right.
You know, and yes, the answer is yes to all those things. But the reason why this story becomes really, really important, because later when you want to ask the question about how the mob gets linked into the JFK assassination, mm-hmm. here's the part that most people don't know. How does Meyer Lansky get tied into Satoshi Nakamoto?
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's the beginning of the story. Why? Because he realizes that another Jew who is like him, because remember, where is Lansky from? He's from Ukraine and also parts of Belarus.
Mm-hmm.
He's also a Russian Jew. He cannot believe that a group of Jews who wants to form Israel, which he's into, is actually setting up several of his people to be killed so that they can get a land for their own people. He is furious about this.
Right.
And Groves he knows about this program. And he knows right away. So what happens? Lansky and Groves form a partnership. Why is this partnership really important for you to understand? Guess who funds the industrial military complex when Eisenhower forces Groves out? Meyer Lansky. That is how General Groves makes the idea to leave the military in 1947-48 when he's forced out. And what does he do? He joins Remington Rand. Remington Rand, and then he merges it with another company called Burroughs. What's the idea that Lansky is giving him? Let me tell you how this goes. The story that I told you before about Turing, that Turing was using cryptography to get the message from the royal family, the papacy, to the other side. Guess what Lansky tells Groves? He goes, now that you're forced out, he goes, if you want to run a shadow government, which is kind of what I do in Murder Inc., my shadow government is a shadow bank that runs in opposition to the Rothschilds. Now, remember, told Danny this, and I'm going to tell you this. Where did the term money laundering come from? Meyer Lansky and Mo Dalitz used laundromats to keep the money away from Woodrow Wilson's federal income tax. That's how it started in 1913 all the way up to this time. So Lansky had 30 years to perfect a system that was running outside the Fed system. Okay? He shares this with General Groves, and this is what now explains why General Groves did so many unusual things when he comes out of the military. So he becomes CEO of Remington Rand, and then he immediately merges it with Burroughs. What does that form? He takes a major military supplier. This was the 67th most powerful stock on the New York Stock Exchange at the time, because that's cash for the system. Then he buys Burroughs, who makes calculators, sewing machines, and this and that, because you need the electronics. And what does Lansky tell him? You do that, we'll start funneling money through this, and we're going to build a computer company, and you're going to sell those computers back to the government so that we have an inside in.
Was that IBM?
No, it's even better than that. Becomes Sperry. Sperry is the first fucking computer system ever in Silicon Valley. And what do they make? 46 mainframe computers, Unix-based, that they sell back to Eisenhower's fucking government. And guess what? Now you have a mole on the inside. And who set up all the financing and the money laundering for this entire event? Lansky helps Groves out. Groves gets on his feet. Next thing you know, who's Groves' next benefactor? This one is easy because you probably know this part of the story. Howard Hughes. That's how we get Grumman. That's how we get all the industrial military players that you know today.
Right.
But what you don't know is in 1986, Sperry becomes Unisys. What else don't you know? Kind of where the story really gets interesting is how this links Lansky to the formation of Bitcoin.
Real quick, before that, on Manhattan Project, I just had a question because my dad is a doctor and he studied at OSU. And he said one of his professors worked on the Manhattan Project, a guy who I think is named Leonard Jossam. That's who I could looked up and could figure out. Do you know if he plays into that whole part at all?
Yeah, I mean, he plays a role, but it's not a central role. I mean, the central story of the Manhattan Project is very simple. It's how science was stolen. What did General Groves do? You have to know a little bit about him. He was an engineer. He also spent time in his training in MIT. Not only was he a general, knew stuff about the military, but he's a process engineer. He worked for the Army Corps of Engineers. Remember, the Manhattan Project is the giant engineering program that the United States has ever done. Literally in 3 years, they make an atomic bomb from nothing. And what does General Groves do? So you know who the links are. He immediately goes to Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles in 1941 and 42 and says, go find me the Jewish guys that Einstein was talking about, because we need their work to build the bomb. So remember, a lot of people say Operation Paperclip happens after the war. What people don't understand is Operation Paperclip actually began before the war, didn't have its name yet, but who was the guy that did it? Dulles got the raw materials, the scientist, from Groves. What did Groves decide to do at the Manhattan Project? Anybody who has watched Oppenheimer knows this story. He kept all the scientists insulated from each other. That's exactly the same mechanism that DARPA uses today. DARPA has 120 cells that completely keep people separated.
Compartmentalization.
Exactly. Because guess what? You do not want scientists understanding truly what's going on when you are the architect behind the curtain, just like the Wizard and the Wizard of Oz.
Do you know much about the rocket scientist and occultist Jack Parsons? Well, I was him also, but Jack Parsons was who I was going to bring up.
Yeah.
There's a strange connection with him too, to all of this, this apparatus, if you will, because Parsons' right-hand man at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory was a guy named Frank Molina. Frank Molina's son, Roger Molina, is married to Ghislaine Maxwell's sister, Christine Maxwell.
Correct.
What the fuck?
Well, but makes me happy that you know some of this history, because guess what? When, this podcast goes live and people think that this stuff is crazy talk. Remember what we said before about where does conspiracy theory end? When there's patents tied to this fucking story.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? There's tons of patents tied to this story. And I'll remind you, what is Nicole Shanahan, she's a patent attorney that worked for Google and
Right.
Sergey. Okay. So when I tell you that my data is pretty good, the answer is yeah, it is. And this story, the architect of this story, begins really when you understand how the accounting helped General Groves get off the floor. Then he used Howard Hughes to really go off the beaten path. And remember what happens. Eisenhower with Patton and MacArthur hated Groves. Why? Because they're out in the theater fighting the war. They won the war with the help of the Russians. And they thought that Groves was trying to steal their thunder by dropping these two bombs. All of them thought that the bombs were superfluous. And history really is they were, but you won't read that in your history books. And Groves is actually forced out of the military by Eisenhower. Okay. He convinces the president at the time that this guy needs to go. He's bad news. This explains to you why these two next events happen. In 1958, after Sputnik goes up, Eisenhower realizes that they're really behind on the science side. Turns out Groves is way ahead because he's the one now selling computers that you need to get to the fucking moon and do this stuff to the military. So he brings Groves people back in. Biggest fucking mistake ever, because ARPA becomes DARPA right in 1958. So basically now you just brought this shadow government back into the United States government. What happens literally 2.5 years later? You get Eisenhower's farewell speech. What is he telling you? He's telling you the same thing that Woodrow Wilson realized. He goes, I invited the enemy into the gate with the Federal Reserve Act. He goes, well, I just invited the fucking enemy to the gate in the industrial military complex. And when you see this for yourself, you start to pull your hair out, because you immediately see, as soon as Eisenhower leaves office and Kennedy comes in, that these guys are weaponized. They do the same thing to Kennedy that they did to Trump. They try to subvert, his presidency right off the bat, and they make it brutal on him. And what they use as their point of contention, which is a huge mistake, is the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs wasn't really what they were truly pissed off about. That was not the big issue at all. It was the money operation that Lansky had running that was helping Groves. That is the key thing. And that story becomes so operational later, because during the Cuban Revolution of 59, everybody in the FBI and CIA, this is now George Kennan, Wild Bill Donovan, these are all the guys that are intimately tied to JFK's assassination that's coming. You know the story with Dulles and his brother. What you may not know is that Dulles and his brother are both members of the Pilgrim Society, which is the society that forms in 1901 that are the loyalists to the crown. So these guys are fucking just like B'nai B'rith. They are working hand in hand with General Groves, both outside and inside the government now. They're moving back and forth, just like you see with FDA guys today. They're moving back in. It's like a revolving door.
Yeah.
And what happens is in 59, when the shit goes crazy, Lansky walks out of the casino there with $3 million. And what does J. Edgar Hoover try to do? J. Edgar Hoover hated Lansky. Do you know why? Because Lansky was Epstein 1.0. He ran the biggest pedophile and LBGT sting operation you can imagine.
Blackmail operation.
And he had fucking J. Edgar Hoover to the balls.
And so Roy Cohn's involved in that too. And that's a paradox that I struggle with, because Roy Cohn was Donald Trump's like premier mentor when he was young. Roy Cohn supposedly taught him everything that he knew.
Well, because that's how Trump got into Manhattan real estate. But you need to realize who's Roy Cohn's master. It's the Zionist Federation. No, that's where you're making a mistake.
Okay.
Remember what I told you, the story that you've missed. Lansky realized that the guys that are eventually tied to Cohn, they're now his mortal enemy. Lansky's banking operation is outside the federal system. Okay. Why is Roy Cohn a big part of the story? Roy Cohn is the attorney that's working with McCarthy going after communists,
Right.
which is the same story of the people that try to kill JFK. It's also the big link to Alton Oshner. Why? Cohn is in that same group of the anti-communists. Who set all that up, my friend? General Groves, because of the story that happens in 43, 44. First at Tehran, and then at Yalta, where actually Stalin tells FDR the truth that the royal family and the papacy are the ones that set this whole thing up. He says, you want to know why I sent people to kill Trotsky in 1940 in Mexico City? Is because this motherfucker pissed off everybody by killing the Romanovs. And it turned out the people that were most stunned by that were the royal family and the Rothschilds. They wanted the Romanovs just put in Siberia until the war was over, because people always forget that the Bolshevik Revolution occurs in the middle of World War I. Mm-hmm. And this created a huge problem for, what the plan of the royal family was. So they just wanted to move his cousin out of the way. Trotsky got the idea because he knew that the Rothschilds were selling bullets on both sides of the war. He's the one that made the unilateral decision in the Communist Party of the USSR to fucking kill the Romanovs. Guess what? Stalin and Lenin knew this was a really bad move. So what does Stalin do? He knows that FDR does not trust him. He knows that General Groves hates his fucking guts because of this communist angle. You know the story. The one thing that's accurate about Churchill truly hates the communists because they took Russia away from the royal family after this Trotsky event. Here's where it gets really interesting. When Stalin tells the story first at Tehran, what is the idea that crops up between Stalin and FDR at this time? It's to reinvigorate what Woodrow Wilson did at the Treaty of Versailles. That's the League of Nations. The League of Nations is the forerunner of the UN. The idea is we need to create some kind of body where the people who win this war can dictate the terms after it. And Stalin feels it's necessary to tell FDR the truth about what happened with Trotsky and the royal family. FDR realizes immediately that he's got some traitors on his side. Okay. So the interesting that happens at Yalta, he tells Stalin at Yalta that not only will we rebuild Europe, we will also rebuild Russia because you did so much to help us destroy the Nazi army in Europe. How did he get that intel? He got that intel from Eisenhower. Eisenhower said that what the Russians are doing to the Germans have helped us more than anything else. And that's the reason why Normandy is pushed off for so long, because the Russians were so successful. How do you know that I'm right about this story? 1960, JFK gives a speech at American University that lauds the Russians and says, we know what you did during World War II. Remember, JFK was a hero in World War II, so he knew his history really well. But who wanted to hide this history was General Groves, because what did General Groves realize? He realized that Hitler really wasn't an enemy. He was a propped up, made up puppet of the royal family. Right. Yeah. So he said, I need a real enemy. So guess who's going to be my real enemy in the Cold War? It's going to be fucking Stalin. So it's going to be Russia. So what happens? That's where Groves decides he's going to perform a coup, but it's not a coup like you ever saw coming. He knew that FDR was going to die of polio because he was in his third term at this time. Remember, this is 1944. Mm-hmm. So he's running for an unprecedented fourth term. So what does Groves do? If you go listen to when Groves is given control of the Manhattan Project, the vice president, three-term vice president named Henry Wallace, gives his speech called The Common Man. This speech would turn your fucking skin if you're a military guy like Groves. Why? Because what does Wallace say? Who's potentially going to be the president after FDR. Mm-hmm. He says, we're going to turn this over to we the people again. In other words, you're not going to turn it over to the people who Groves thinks won the war, which is him. Okay. So he goes to the most influential Democrat in the Democratic Party, because remember, FDR is a Democrat. That's a guy named Jimmy Burns. Jimmy Burns is a senator from South Carolina. He tells Jimmy Burns, no matter what you do at the DNC this time, you get rid of fucking Henry Wallace and you install a Manchurian candidate. They select Harry Truman. He's a no-name senator from Missouri who really has done nothing. Okay.
Are you
So
using that term Manchurian candidate like literally like an MKUltra victim or just a puppet that they
no,
control
he's a
control?
fucking idiot. He's a useful idiot. He's like
Okay.
Trump.
Okay.
In other words, he's like Kamala. He's programmable.
Yeah.
He'll
Yeah.
do whatever the guys that he thinks won the war does. So what happens in this military coup? Because this is the real coup nobody ever talks about.
Mm-hmm.
How did they get control of the executive branch? So at the DNC in Chicago, I think it was December 44, in 9 minutes, they suspend the vote counting. Nighttime comes, they give all these, Jimmy Burns tells people, because he's the Chuck Schumer of the day, if you switch your votes to Truman, we'll give you the postmaster general spot. We'll give you this. We'll give you that. Magically, they come back the next day. Everything flips. You can go look at the archives of the DNC to see that this is true. Magically, Truman becomes the vice president. What happens then? FDR gets reelected in January of 45. Truman is the vice president. Truman doesn't know anything about the bomb. Okay. Kruse tells FDR not to tell him anything. FDR decides he's going to go to Potsdam. He goes to Potsdam and meets Stalin again and reiterates to Stalin that we're going to do the League of Nations. We're going to call it the UN. And he hands Stalin the UN preamble that he wrote. He said, this is what I envision after the war. We are going to set the terms for both Europe and Russia, and you're going to be a charter member. Okay? That's how it goes. What happens mid-April? He fucking dies. Who becomes president? Harry Truman. Guess what happens at this time? Truman, I fucked up a little bit. I said that FDR went to Potsdam. He didn't. Truman goes to Potsdam after he's killed. Groves tells Truman everything that he was promised at Yalta and at Tehran, you reverse it. You tell him, fuck you. So guess what happens? FDR did write the preamble of the UN. Who wrote the rules and regulations? General Groves and the industrial military complex. This is the reason why in 2009, the only time you hear Gaddafi address the UN, he casually points out, why is the preamble and the rules and regulations incongruent? Now you have the story why, my friends. Okay? This is the reason why. And this is the reason why Hillary and Obama made sure they killed Gaddafi right after that. Okay? Because that globalist plan is out in the open now. So when Potsdam occurs, Stalin realizes he just got fucked in a huge way because he thought the vice president would do the same thing that FDR would. If Henry Wallace is in, there is no Cold War at all. The industrial military complex loses most of its juice before it even had time to get set up. That's where we really go off the rails. If you want to know the truth, my diagnosis is the death of FDR from the polio stroke is the fucking key. And then you bring in the whole story of the polio jab. Why is the polio jab huge part of this?
SV40 and stuff.
You got it, bro. Now you're beginning to see how the next 20 years are going to go all the way up to 1963. And when you begin to see how all these pieces fit, you go, Jesus Christ, this is like the greatest story never told. And when you realize it's how science was stolen, it's how the executive branch was stolen. When the Warren Commission comes out, that's when Congress is stolen. And the whole goal has always to be push the globalist social agenda, because what is that a synonym for? The monarchy. That's exactly what it is. And when you look back of what the modus operandi is of the big players, the royal family is simple. They want Russia and the United States back. That's a Lloydial title. I used that term with Danny, and I said, you need to understand a little bit about it. And I said, the next big thing that comes up in this, the bankers are in on both sides of this because they're making huge amounts of money on both sides of these wars. They were making huge money in World War I and huge money in World War II. Who's the third part that nobody ever talks about? This is the papacy. Why? The papacy is run by the same fucking corrupt bankers. So when you begin to realize that the popes are tied to this, and then you find out about the Mondiac Concordant, which is what the transfer agreement is called. There's
I think that's the Havara agreement, right?
well, that's what the Jews call it,
Mm-hmm.
but it's called the Mondiat Concordant of 1933 that's made between the Catholic Church and Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
And guess who set that up? That's Pope Pius XI. Then who is the architect that's running this whole thing? It's going to be the guy that eventually becomes Pope Pius XII after this guy dies in 1936. So guess what? In 1933, what is the Pope's angle on this? When all is said and done, and you get the one world government, that the Pope gets Jerusalem. And Muslims, Jews, and Christians all come under the power of the Pope. In other words, we're going back to the system before the Protestant Reformation, where the Pope is linked to all the monarchs. That's actually what this whole fucking thing is really about. It's about a loyal title of Vatican City and a loyal title of the lands that the royal families controlled for hundreds of years.
So just creating a neo-feudal system.
Correct.
Essentially.
Medievalism to put us back in the Dark Ages. That's really what it was about, where they have ultimate control. And when you think about the players that come later after JFK, we're talking about Hale Boggs, John McCloy. We're talking about Gerald Ford. We're talking about his AGs. We're talking about Nixon and his presidency. All these people played a role in all of the story in the 50s and 60s. People forget Nixon is fucking Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years. Okay. He even took a step back to let Kennedy win in 60. Everybody knows that election was a scam. Why? Because it came down to two swing states. What were the two swing states? Illinois and Texas. And guess what the promise of Joe Kennedy was? Promise in Illinois was made the deal with the crime family, Meyer Lansky, support Kennedy, get him elected, and we won't come after you. What was the deal in Texas and the Bush family? The H.L. Hunts, the guys that own the Kansas City Chiefs and the Clint Murchisons of the Cowboys, we'll support big oil. But we'll support Rockefeller. We'll support all that thing. Everything gets fucking turned on its head. Why? Because Joe Kennedy never has the truth discussion with JFK or Bobby Kennedy. What does Bobby Kennedy do as soon as he comes out? He goes right after fucking Sam Giancana. And the big one is Marcello down in New Orleans. In fact, most people don't even fucking realize Bobby Kennedy has Marcello on trial in New Orleans in federal court the day his brother gets shot. In fact, he gets acquitted that day, the same day he's shot.
Unbelievable.
Well, that's what I'm saying. The story, look, this story, in my opinion, before you go vote, is the single most important thing. I mean, people ask me all the time, like, Jack, how can you vote for somebody who, your own researchers told you that Trump was tied to these guys? I'm going to tell you, the part of the story I haven't told you yet, because I know this is a bow that you're going to have tied in your head.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to tell you the most nefarious guy to most people in this story you think is Lansky. I'm going to tell you he's the biggest hero in the story.
Okay.
And the reason why Trump is tied to the Meyer Lansky types. What you need to understand is Lansky sets up the shadow government's financing of the industrial military complex. This is completely outside the Fed system. Mm-hmm. What's the next part of the story that you probably know a little bit about? This is now, we're in the pre 1970s. Mm-hmm. Something magically happens between 59 and 69 that you need to be aware of. And I think you know part of it. 59, I told you about the $3 million that goes missing from Cuba. From 1960 to 1969, when Lucky Luciano's family basically go and have to kill Bugsy Siegel because all the money they're pouring into Vegas wasn't paying off. Within 2 hours of Siegel getting murdered, remember, Lansky held off the assassination from the Italian mob twice on Siegel before the third time he's taken out. Why? Because they're in the red again. 2 hours after he goes in, Sam Cohen, Meyer Lansky, and Mo Dalitz walk into the Flamingo Casino. The first month, they have a 50% increase in profits. Why? All the things that I told you in the Danny Jones podcast become operational, blocking
Blue
out the
light.
windows, getting rid of the fucking clocks, putting the one-armed bandits. But here's the big one. What's the first thing he does? He goes and asks gamblers on the floor of the pits, why do you guys leave always in the mid-afternoon and never come back at night? He goes, well, there's no place to eat. So what does he start? The buffets. The all-you-can-eat buffets, you never have to leave. Guess what? That increased profits literally in the first 2 to 3 months after the hit on Siegel. And all of a sudden now everybody is like, okay, we're going to let this guy go. Then, remember what I told you? The original story from MKUltra was a mescaline fluoride story. It was a drug story. Magically, it gets changed because of what Modalities is doing with light in the casinos.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when George Kennan's, the Wild Bill Donovans, the guys that are now running, because remember, it's no longer ONI and OSS because Groves on the way out the door gets his Manchurian candidate to put the National Security Act in an executive order. That executive order becomes big. Why? Remember the beginning of this podcast when I talked to you about Becker and things that he taught me? Here's one of the big ones. Becker found out, he said to me, he says, Jack, he goes, do you know how a law is passed in the United States? And I said, yeah, Congress makes a bill, president signs, it's a law. He goes, do you know that there's another way to do that? And I said, no, tell me what the way is. He said, if you create an executive order and it's published within 10 days in the Federal Register, it effectively acts like a law. He said, go look at the National Security Act of 1947 and you'll notice something. So I went back and looked at it. Do you know that the ONI and OSS don't become the CIA until 1948 operationally? You know why? General Groves saw to it that those 10-day window wasn't published in the Federal Register. You know why he did that? Lansky told him he needed about a year and a half to set up all his financing. So guess what happens? The CIA, if you look at their founding documents, are not until 1948 through a clerical error that's made at this time. Dude, go fact check me.
You found that out just by looking at the National Security Act?
I found that out because Becker fucking told me that. He figured it out. And he told me, he goes, this is when everything was stolen. And when I figured out all the people that he was dealing with in the U.S. military, this is at the Joint Chiefs level, these are now General Groves 3.0, 4.0. Those are the guys that fucking take Becker out. So what did Becker do? He actually did the diagnosis to figure out, how did these fucking guys figure all this shit out? Went right back to General Groves. And General Groves is operational when literally Becker is he's like pre-med and medical school. So he would have never known this stuff. But from 1979 through 2007, he fucking figured all this shit out. When he told me that, I was like, so this now really begins to make sense because Becker didn't know a lot about Lansky. Okay. He knew a little bit. He knew about the U-boat issue. He also knew that there were some interesting characters from the mob that were in the U.S. military. He's the guy that clued me in to a guy named Ira Malnick. And I'm like, who the fuck is Ira Malnick? Turns out that's how I made the link between Malnick and Lansky. Malnick is Lansky's attorney. And why does he become really important in this whole story? Turns out, guess where he served? 1953 to 1956 in the U.S. Army. And he was part of helping Lansky get all the financing in for General Groves at this very unusual time. And it turns out to this very day, Malnick he's still alive today. Malnick is a big part of the financing arm of this. So here's the next part of the story that is really going to blow your mind. So I told you from 1959 to 69, J. Edgar Hoover has got asked to the wall to go after Lansky because he knows he's got compromising pictures of him with children and with gay lovers. Okay. And you know who those gay lovers are. They're well documented out there, but he's got deep proof of this issue. So J. Edgar Hoover uses the best forensic accountants to go after Lansky. And guess what happens? They can't find anything out under J. Edgar Hoover's watch, literally 11 years. So what magically happens in 1969? Ira Malnick gets word that J. Edgar Hoover has got now the IRS involved in this story. And this is particularly concerning to Lansky because something you may not know about that we're going to talk about later, part of the money laundering scheme that Lansky sets up has to do with the IRS computer. Okay. And it gets very, very interesting for Malnick. He tells Lansky, look, the Mossad, because remember, Israel now is a country in 48. The Mossad is a real organization now. He says, look, the Mossad set up a similar kind of arrangement that the federal government in the United States set up for Lee Harvey Oswald to go to Russia so that he could eventually deliver
To
the cigar.
Castro.
Right. So what was the situation? Malnick tells Lansky to avoid this subpoena, go to fucking Israel. Israel will give you a passport because the Mossad got their bureau. I forget the name of it. I know it's got some weird name to pass a law that any Jew can be repatriated no matter what their history is. So guess what? Now the Mossad's protecting Lansky. Okay. So they deliver the subpoena in Israel to Lansky about the money laundering thing. And Lansky knows exactly what this is all about. He knows it's about all the dirt that he's got on J. Edgar Hoover and the government. But what J. Edgar Hoover doesn't know, he doesn't know that Lansky set up General Groves' operation on the outside in the shadow government. He has no idea that he is fucking with the smartest guy in the room. Okay. Lansky tells the Israelis and he tells the Mossad, he goes, I know exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back and tell them the truth. And Israel goes, what do you mean you're going to tell them the truth? He goes, I'm going to tell them how I beat the system. I'm going to tell them how I beat the Rothschilds. I'm going to tell them the biggest hole in the fucking Fed system. So what does he do? He goes back to the United States with an Israeli passport and a United States passport. He gets arrested. He gets brought in. He proceeds to tell the federal government exactly how he did what he did for Murder Inc. He never mentions that he's doing the same thing for the industrial military complex. So what magically happens here? This is when, and you have to remember who's the president at this time. This is when LBJ is going out. So follow the attorney generals in this whole story. These guys are going hard after Lansky. Next president that comes in is Nixon. Nixon, of course, knows everything that's going on, but he has no idea about what Lansky is really doing. Nixon decides not to play ball with the FBI. So the FBI sets him up in Watergate. He gets out. Big part of this story. He has an attorney general that only lasts for like 8 months. You can look him up. Elliot Richardson. You know who he's part of? The Pilgrim Society, just like Dulles was. Okay. Again, you can fact check all this. He gets taken out in 73. Who comes in? Edward Levi, who is Skull and Crossbones and Mossad. Holds dual passports. Okay. He's Gerald Ford's attorney general, who also sat on what? The Warren Commission. So we have everything set up. So to get back to 69, what does Lansky do? He goes in and fucking tells them how he stole the money. He said, here's how it is. Fiat system is broken. You need to fucking do, there's no way you can stop me from doing what I'm doing. Here's how I do it. And then he goes the next level. He says, this is how you should stop it. He goes, you know all those computers I sold to General Groves that he put in the computer? He says, you need to use computers to track your money so you know where every dollar is going. He goes, that's actually the real fix. Now, my friend, what happens the next year? Bank Secrecy Act comes out in 1970. What is the Bank Secrecy Act? It's actually a protection mechanism for the Federal Reserve so they know where fucking everybody's money is, because Lansky tells them there's a fucking giant hole in the system. He tells them that he's penetrated the IRS computers. He knows where the fucking Rothschilds are moving their money before they fucking do it. What happens next? We get the Nixon shock, don't we, in 1971, where we remove gold, so it's a controlled demolition of fiat money. In other words, the government knows that they got to have a different plan. What's that plan? They immediately, all the banking families in the Fed, talk to the people in Basel and the BIS and says, you need to come up with an idea for computerized money. Now, why does Lansky do all this, my friend? That's the next question you should be asking yourself.
Just so
Because
insane. I mean, these things are with
Lansky,
CBDCs and stuff now, and it's going back all the way to Meyer
correct.
Lansky. I
Well,
mean,
guess what? Lansky has another plan for these cocksuckers. Remember, I told you that here's the guy that's Jeffrey Epstein before Jeffrey Epstein's ever there, and he turns
mhm,
out to be a good player in the story. Not that his intent is good, because you know who he's trying to fuck? He's trying to fuck the Rothschilds. He's trying to fuck
mhm.
the Rockefellers. He's trying to fuck the Brown Harrimans, because guess what they did? They allowed the government to try to come in and fuck him. Remember, shadow government is with Lansky, but the real government isn't. So Lansky goes, okay, hold my beer. So what does Lansky casually know? Remember, I told you the story about the guy that he pulls off the U-boat and he finds out that Turing is really sending information one way. What's the mathematics that Turing used? It's called cryptography. You want to know something else that Lansky figured out? Remember what Lansky is? He's an idiot savant of accounting. He knows everything you possibly can about money. What does he notice about the Munitions Act that's passed in the United States? Do you know that cryptography is considered a munition in that pact? So what does he do? He said, I know that this is something they don't have an answer for. So remember the guy that I just mentioned the story to you about, Ira Melnick. Magically, what happens to Lansky in 1973-74, through this whole transition, Meyer Lansky gets acquitted. They let him out. And you know what the government's response was? The government's response was, well, he's old and elderly, and we think he's going to die. Just so you know, Lansky lives until 1983. 10 years later. That's total bullshit. Why? Because they think that Lansky has turned state's evidence. Turns out that's not the case. What Malnick decides to do, they have the best forensic accountants in the world. The government finds out they can't find one penny of what Lansky or Mo Dallas did with the money at all. So when I'm researching all this stuff, I look at the relationship in the last 10 years between Lansky and Ira Malnick. And some of the magical things that I find out, that Lansky has no assets. He looks like he's almost a pauper. He's ready to die. But this guy, Malnick, lives in South Florida. He lives in a $60 million house. And I'm going, there's something interesting going on here. So I start to look in the late 1970s to see where magically some of this money has wound up, because it's believed that Lansky was able to amass about $500 million of his own. I find out that Lansky uses the same banker and the same bank in Geneva that the CIA does. Okay. And it's in the Warren report. So I start following the money track there. Magically, what I find out is there's a lot of money movements that go through some of the front companies. These are shell companies that are run out of Florida that you'll never realize tie back to Malnick. Malnick is moving all this money into offshore accounts to cryptography research places that are in Amsterdam. And I'm going, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard in my life. So then I find out who's associated with all this. And it turns out it's this young Jewish guy that went to Cal Berkeley named David Chaum. And I looked into David Chaum and I'm like, this is crazy. His parents are poor. He's poor. He has no money. Yet in the late 1970s and early 1980s, as soon as he gets his PhD, he's able to open up 3 companies that are on cryptography research. And here's the crazy part. They focus in on things that no one was focused in on at this time: secrecy, anonymity, and be able to move money in payments where you'd never see any of this stuff. There's no impetus for this in the late 70s and early 80s.
Yeah.
Okay. But magically, this guy's got millions of dollars being funded from somewhere through shell companies to do this research. And what's the other thing that's tied to this? You'll be very interesting. The forerunners of Dominion voting machines is one of the other projects that David Chaum is invested in. And I'm going, this is the craziest fucking thing ever. So
Yeah.
Lansky dies in 83. He dies a pauper. Nobody can find the trail. Well, Malnick from 83 to now, keeps funding these people. What magically happens? This is where the good part of the story happens. Lansky realizes in the 70s and 80s that the idea that he gave the federal government, while it's a good one, it's going to be really hard to set up this type of network. You're going to have really good computer systems. What is the federal government set up with? Set up with centralized systems. Okay, centralized materials that Lansky sold to General Groves. What did Lansky not prepare for? He didn't prepare for the cypherpunks. The cypherpunks, who David Chaum is one of, start to use open networks. They start to use things like Tor. These things happen way after. But what's the interesting part of this? In the early 1980s, two things Chaum comes up with: blind signatures, and I'm blanking on the other one. But anyway, these are the key things to make an anonymous payment system that no one can track. And it's a really brilliant thing that he's come up with. In fact, he coins the term DigiCash. DigiCash is the first electronic payment system. What do I call that? I call it Bitcoin 1.0. But who's really important in this story? It's not Chaum. Chaum is not who Satoshi Nakamoto is.
That's what I
Lansky,
was about to ask you.
not. It's not. Chaum, however, creates a system that is as close to Bitcoin as you become. And remember, I told you that Chaum is a PhD guy. Magically, Chaum has two clients for DigiCash. You know who they are? Deutsche Bank, the central bank of Germany, and then a small little bank in the United States, Mark Twain Bank, which ironically is tied to all the shell companies that Ira Malbec is linked to. And magically in 1998, they go belly up. They go boom. They couldn't make any money because they only had 5,000 clients. So I told you this project of figuring out what Lansky's does, it's really difficult. Well, where's the good news come? You have this now black internet called Tor. You have all these cyberpunks working on it. All of a sudden, the idea that Lansky has, that Chaum has, becomes open sourced. In other words, the rest of the world starts to put their 2 cents in. So Chaum is an older guy now. His company is sold for pieces and parts on the steps of a California courthouse. You know who buys it? A guy named Naveen Jan. Who's Naveen Jan? Naveen Jan runs a company called Infosys. Infosys buys all these patents from this company. Do you know what Infosys does? Remember you talked about Magellan earlier? What if I was to tell you that Infosys was pre-Google what Google was? And what if I was to tell you that Naveen Jan worked initially for Bill Gates at Microsoft? What if I was to tell you he came over on one of those visa programs, learned the business from Gates, and then realized that search and surveillance were a big part of this, and he understood completely what was going on. He turns out to be friends with a lot of the people that eventually show up in the PayPal mafia.
Didn't a lot of the early search engines start as a way for all the universities to just communicate information,
Correct.
kind of?
So you're back to the ARP idea. You see how
Yeah.
you're seeing the evolution, how this comes?
Oh,
So
yeah.
what happens after this? Naveen Jan, do you know where his visa was first incorporated before he went to work for Microsoft?
I mean, I could
Burroughs.
guess. Okay.
Burroughs for, so when in other words, he worked for fucking General Groves people. Remember, Burroughs and Remington Rand become what? Sperry. So he cut his teeth there. He kind of knew the link between Lansky, the shadow government. That's why he's the guy that buys it on the courthouse steps. Now he knows that the system is not ready for prime time, but he knows that the pieces and parts really are important. So what happens next in this evolution? Magically, a guy from the UK named Adam Back starts to come up with something called Hashcash. And that's where the proof of work mechanism gets added to the things that Chaum does. But the most magical part of the story, the real guy, that's the big player, why Lansky is really a hero to us, is David Chaum is a resident PhD director of a kid named Len Sassaman. Len Sassaman does something really amazing. You know what he does? At 18 years old, he begins to retool the TCP/IP network of the internet. You know what that means? He absolutely optimizes the mTOR black network. He's the leader in the United States to know what he's doing. And when he signs up later in his life to become a PhD guy, who is his resident advisor? David Sham. What's the final piece that Sassaman adds to the mix to all of this? He takes Sham, he takes the proof of work mechanism, and he adds one thing to it: timestamping. And when the timestamping is added, the great financial crisis that you know about in 2008 happens. That's with Bush to Obama, the TARP thing, all the guys, where we get Jamie Dimon, his boss's wheel. These are all the guys that fucking Meyer Lansky hated because they tried to fuck him. Here's the ultimate fuck job. The white paper gets written anonymously. 3 months after that, Leonard Sassman kills himself. I believe Leonard Sassman is Satoshi Nakamoto. Now, here's the best part of the story for you to hear. Why is this truly a sad story? You wanted to talk to me for a long time about MKUltra and the Brain Health Initiative. Do you know why Sassman killed himself? As a teenager, he was brutally depressed from all his tech use. Why did he kill himself at the end of his life? He developed a functional neurologic deficit from the abuse of technology. Got so bad that he did himself in. There is not one email from Satoshi after he died. He died on March 7th, 2009.
Oh, shit.
So they just had a big HBO special where they named Peter Todd.
I saw.
Satoshi Nakamoto. I got news for you, bro. They haven't done the detective homework that I did. It turns out that Meyer Lansky really, remember how we always say Satoshi is all of us? Meyer Lansky is where the idea came from. His money fueled the research of the cryptographic research, because what did Lansky know? He knew they killed fucking Turing for a reason, and he knew the answer was going to be in cryptography.
There's no chance in hell HBO would ever say that, because just the path that people could follow back, the breadcrumbs. I mean, Jesus Christ.
I'm just telling you. So when you heard me say to Danny, now you understand the fuel to take away from the industrial military complex is the use of Bitcoin, because guess what? They need fiat money to run their games. They always thought that Bitcoin was going to be their own game. And it turns out when it got open source, they lost control of it. So now I want to put, this is the whipped cream and cherry on this Sunday. I want you to come fast forward to what was the first use case of Bitcoin? Silk Road. Who ran? Russ Ulbricht. What do you know about Russ Ulbricht? I want you to go look at the charging sheet and then go look at the subpoena for Meyer Lansky. You know what you're going to notice? They're almost exact duplicates. So do you want to know why Russ got 2 life sentences for something he shouldn't have got? Because that was the fucking Federal Reserve knowing that they were punishing fucking Meyer Lansky. That's what Russ got.
What's the connection with Ulbricht and Meyer Lansky? Just the
There is none. There is none. The only thing is Russ, or I should say Ross, is doing exactly what Murder Inc. would have done. This is exactly the same business that they would have run, and you would have never discovered it.
So the Jewish mob is partly responsible for the creation of Bitcoin.
Not partly. I'm going to tell you that, and this is the key part, not the Zionist Federation.
Sure.
It's the Meyer Lansky people who were so fucking pissed off at the federal government and the people that set up Israel, which are the Rothschilds and Rockefellers.
My thing with Bitcoin is, I understand all the principles. I get that, but the dependence of, you have to have technology, you have to have an active power grid to be able to access your.
You don't think you have to have an active power grid to run a bank?
Well, what if there's some sort of crazy, thing that goes down?
Say if there's a CME.
Yeah,
guess what?
That's what I'm saying.
Bitcoin network is underground, just like some of the critical infrastructure for the United States government. Do you think the banking industry is? No. So guess what? Here's where I can tell people are not really good thinkers. Bro, fiat money is about the most tenuous thing ever. And you want to know something?
Of course.
Lansky's the fucking one that delivered that message to the fuckers that are running that system. If you don't think they're fucking scared shitless of it, I want to remind you about something. Pay attention to what's going on right now. The Jamie Dimons, the Senator Warrens, the Brad Shermans. Why are they in fucking Congress going after Bitcoin? Because they know they can't fucking stop it, dude. That's the whole point. And guess what? They are trying like crazy to get us to the next emergency, which is probably a cyber attack.
It will be, yeah.
To get a CBDC. Guess what? They think the CBDC is the key, but why can't they get to a CBDC fast enough? Here's where this should be the bow on the thing. Fourth Amendment, bro. You got to stack the court to get there. Got it? That's the part of the story that Danny didn't want to go down.
Have you heard of have you ever heard of Catherine Austin Fitts or Whitney Webb?
Yeah.
Have you ever their work?
Yeah. Yep. And again, Catherine Austin Fitts and both of them are great. They don't know anything about the science part of this. They don't know anything about Becker. They know about the missing money. They know about the links between the Zionists. But guess what? You know what that's like? That's like walking into a whorehouse with a soft dick. You're not getting anywhere. You need to know the whole story. Sure. So yeah, I get it, but I'm not interested in either one of them because they don't have all the parts. To make the diagnosis, you can't have 50% of the story. You have to have the whole percent of the story. Captain Austin Fitts clearly knows the federal government's criminal. We all know that. I mean, you have to be almost a fucking idiot not to know that at this point. And Whitney Webb just keeps running in the webs of the Jewish mob. Look, you think Whitney Webb is any better than the best forensic accountants CIA and FBI had, who were after Lansky this whole time?
Yeah.
No. So why am I going to pay attention to people that I know only have a half truth? I mean, if you know
that's where you come in. I mean, they're able
me and
to
my science work.
They're able to give those ideas to people on the surface level, but then that's where you come in, you know.
Yeah, but I go after people that deal in half truths because half truth always lead to full lies. That's the reason I give them no quarter. And this is the reason why, if you follow my work, I mean, and I haven't talked to you about this, but just remember on July 4th, 2020, I had 100 people gathered illegally at my house to tell them this story. And you know who was my guest? Judith Very Baker. And she brought all the receipts from this story.
Like that she had been involved with Harvey Oswald and all that stuff?
Right. I told her, I said, I need to see the original Riley Coffee receipts of both Lee and you. And she brought them, dude. And she brought a whole lot more. Those 100 people got to see the truth for themselves. And what did I tell those 100 people? I said, mark my words right now, before this starts, you all need to go out and buy Bitcoin. And out of that group of 100, I'm sad to tell you, 91 didn't listen. The 9 that listened now are multi-millionaires. Why? That time at that meeting, Bitcoin was at 7,500. Okay. I'm going to tell you, Judith Very Baker's still alive to this day. She's like 80, close to 85, I think. But she's the only one that didn't get taken out. Why? Because who is in control of watching over her? Santo Traficante, who worked with who? Meyer Lansky. Lansky knew that she wasn't a big part of this at all. He knew that she was telling the truth and that she was not going to be a big issue in this whole affair. And it turns out they were all correct. They would have went and killed this little high school girl. This would have been a huge, huge front straight to Oshner. And that's the real part of the story that I think Danny missed in New Orleans that I picked up on. Jim Garrison's big mistake is that he didn't go after Oshner. Instead, he went after Clay Shaw. And the real thing that I think happens is if he goes after Oshner, we find out this whole story in 1967. That's the real part of the story. And that's the reason why I give no quarter to Webb or Fitz, because they don't know the story of Oshner. And I laid that out for you very clearly in the Danny Jones podcast. And I told you how I knew those things because that's where I did my residency. I actually worked with his son for 2 years. I fact-checked everything on that side of the equation. And I worked with the Linac. That was linked to the SV40 story.
Mm-hmm.
I even tracked it all the way back to where it began and the
Did you
doctors
ever
that were
find
linked to
out
it.
where it went after
Huh.
that place was shut down?
No, it went to Oshner. It went to the place I did my residency in. It moved from Henry Clay Boulevard to Jefferson Highway, and it
Okay.
was in the basement. I used it when we did gamma knife preparation for 2 years for brain tumors. Dude, I knew right away, there's no way this hospital could afford a piece of equipment like this. I mean, I'm not a dumbass. And like I said, this whole story, in terms of diagnosing it, as soon as I got on the monetary story, it wasn't hard to figure out. But you know what the problem is? Nobody was tenacious for the truth. Nobody was curious. And it turned out I don't figure any of this story out if it's not for Robert O. Becker. And
Mm-hmm.
remember, reason that he and I got linked was because of the science. That is the key part of this story. It's the reason why all the people that are working in journalism that go after the mob angle or the Castronaut and Fitz or the Whitney Webb, dude, they're barking under the wrong stones.
Doesn't it eventually lead to the science angle? You know what you're talking about.
You
You
would
have to
hope
know the
so.
entrance to go
I think
in.
I think what led to the science story, my friend, is 2020 to 2024.
Yeah.
I mean, when I told you that I had my smoking gun from Kevin McKiernan, that's when Jack Kruse came out of the shadows. That's
Mm-hmm.
when I started to tell you, you need to hear this story. And look, there's only one way SV40 can show up from 1951 to 2022. It's because it's a bioweapons program. That's exactly that's what links the two stories together.
Yeah.
And when you understand how the polio virus and the vaccine are linked to the coup that occurs at the industrial military complex with Groves, Henry Wallace, and Truman, all of a sudden you begin to get straight through the bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, you can filter every single thing that Catherine Austin Fitz and Whitney Webb have gone down. Like, for example, we didn't even get into the octopus story. Well, where does this play with Lansky? You know, the whole octopus story is about the Iran Contra thing, is when Traficante's idea to work with Castro and connect the cartels in Colombia to the ones in Mexico. That's
Right.
really what the Iran Contra affairs are all about.
To make
When this
money off the
happens,
opioid
they act
crisis, right?
no, not to make money off it. That was what they wanted to do, but they also wanted to addict America because that was an MKUltra idea. You
Mm-hmm.
don't need to use mescaline. How about we use opiates?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it turned out, why is it a good deal? What's the other part of the opiate system that's linked to the light story? POMC actually creates beta endorphin. I don't expect a guy like you to know that. But that's exactly the reason why they did it. Again, ties back to the fucking science part of the story that nobody understands.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's easy to see that all of that would create, this pile of money for black ops and stuff. And it's easy to
Well,
see the
think about
MK
who's
Ultra
running.
angle get us all
Think
addicted
about
to
who's running
heroin.
the CIA. Think about the octopus story when it gets set up. I'm blanking on the guy's name. Colby is the guy that runs it, but who's right before Colby in '73 that makes
Bill
the
Colby, is
decision
that who you're talking about?
before the Church Commission comes out to destroy all the files? Yeah, Colby is the one after, but it's Richard Helms in '73 that destroys all the MKUltra files. Why?
Right.
They don't want you to know anything about what I'm telling you right now. And guess what? That's literally 2 years before you get the Church Commission. So honestly, you're going to find it really hard to piece MKUltra now to what they're doing in inning 4, 5, 6 in South America. But dude, they haven't stopped. They're using light to the nth degree. And Sergey Brin, he's a walking candidate, a Jack Dorsey walking candidate for this kind of stuff. Dorsey pulled himself out. He got deprogrammed. He's out of that mix. Nicole Shanahan is trying to do the same thing right now, pull herself out of the mix. But make no mistake, Zuckerberg's in, his kids are in. All the people that are linked to that Epstein list, they are all fucking soldiers of the MKUltra Brain Initiative. Is Barry in? Is his wife in? Or maybe we should say husband in, who's been transgendered. Are the Bushes in? Every single one of them are fucking dirty, bro. The Clintons, they're knee deep into shit. But it's not, Fauci's been in since the Reagan thing. You'll even be surprised to find out. I did a private thing for my members. Lansky was even involved in the selection of Fauci by Reagan.
Wow.
How do you like that?
Is this like
And the reason
pre-AIDS
why,
epidemic?
when no way pre-AIDS, you have to know a little bit something about Fauci. He grew up in my hometown.
Mhm.
Where did he go to school? Jesuit Regis High School.
Of
Then he
course.
went to Holy Cross Jesuit College. Remember, I told you what's Pope Pius?
Yeah.
He's one of the guys involved in this. Who's the first Jesuit Pope we have right now? Francis. And what he's all about? Transgenderism. Dude, this fucking story, you have no idea how many ties there, but how does Lansky come across Tony Fauci? You go do your homework on Fauci. You'll find out in his interim of time, he was working on building some things in New York City. Okay. So that's how the mob found out that he wanted to go and pre-med. And the mob said, well, we're getting ready to lose Oshner right about now.
Mhm.
So we need to get somebody else. How does Fauci get involved to the infectious disease epidemic? You're going to be stunned. At the end of medical school in the 1960s, when he's coming out, the mob knows at that time what branch of the service you're going to go in. So he picks the medical service and he magically picks infectious diseases. So guess where he gets fast tracked to? All the way up. And what does Lansky tell all the people that he's working with? This kid right here from New York, we know about him. He used to work on our construction sites when he was in high school, college, and medical school. That's how he made extra money. The mob bosses in New York City watched over him, bro. He was hand selected for the job.
You're telling me if I research into Fauci's or that he was
Promise
bolstered and
you,
propped up by Lansky? That is insane.
correct.
I'm surprised
No,
I've
it's
never
not.
heard about that. No, I mean
No,
insane. It's crazy, but
of
it's
course you're not
believable.
going to hear about it. Remember what I told you. You live in a world right now where things are whitewashed.
Mhm.
Okay. You
Oh,
have
I
to do
understand.
your homework.
I understand
Remember
that.
when I did a lot of my homework, my friend? Told you in 2007 when I talked to Becker, he's the one that told me about Volkow. He said, Fauci put him in. He told me, he says, you need to go look at Fauci's background. Back at that time, it was very easy to do because none of this stuff was whitewashed
Yeah.
because it's all pre-COVID. So I found out exactly where Fauci grew up. I found out that he worked on construction sites. What do you know about construction? How did Rudy Giuliani make his name, bro, in New York? He actually found out that the mob, Lansky guys, after Lansky's dead, were getting 20, 30, 40% selling concrete to all the fucking construction sites on Manhattan Island. Dude, they've been running this fucking show for you don't even know how long. And here's Fauci as a young kid who wasn't tied to the mob. He's just an Italian guy that they gave a job to. And when the mob found out that he wanted to be a doctor, they're like, okay, let's grease the skids for this kid.
Mhm.
Let's see how far this will go. And it went pretty fucking far, dude. He basically ran infectious disease for the United States.
Yeah.
And magically in 1982, Reagan appoints him. Well, you'll find out that there's lots of ties between Ira Malnick and fucking Ronald Reagan. How do you know that's true? Guess what happens right after that? The Iran-Contra stuff. And what's the Iran-Contra stuff all about? It's about the drug trade. It's about all the ideas that Lansky came up with Traficante with Castro. Now it's at industrial scale where you're going to take the guys making it, the guys getting it through right through the border. All this was helped. The whole story about Central America bro, this story goes way back. And when you find out the players that are tied to this, Colby, Helms.
Mhm.
Helms is the guy that destroys all the papers before the Church Commission. Dude, you can see this fucking criminal cabal in front of your eyes. And if you look at the octopus murders, I think the guy that was tied to all that was a guy named Danny Casolaro. Danny Casolaro is an independent researcher, much like Whitney Webb or Catherine Austin Fitz, who got too close to the truth and he got fucking taken out. He got taken out by these people. And that's the whole octopus part. That's the step between MKUltra, between Obama. Okay, that's going on during Reagan, Clinton. You want to know how crazy this is? Where all the drugs goes up? Look at the links between FEMA, Mena, Arkansas, and John Gotti. That's where all the fucking drugs come in, dude. That's why Clinton's part of this.
Mhm.
And Gotti was running that game while they're trying to fucking put Gotti out of business in New York. Who did that? That's Rudy Giuliani, bro. How did Rudy Giuliani find out what Gotti was doing? It was called the Cement Club. Remember how they got Gotti? They got him on RICO accounts, bro. That's how he cleaned on Manhattan. He actually effectively ended um, Murder Inc. as it stands today. The mob is still going on, but they're not as powerful as what they were in Lansky's time. Why? Because Gotti assassinated Paul Castellano. Castellano had the greatest gig going in New York City at the time. That's actually how they found fucking Fauci. Dude, this cement club, every single job in Manhattan, you got to remember something. I grew up on Manhattan. Every single construction job was controlled by the mob through the cement business and the dump truck business.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what they did? How did they? They even got Trump. Trump fucking paid the number to the mob. And Trump doesn't know that he was paying the number to the mob. Believe it or not, the guys that you talked about, that was his friends. Mm-hmm. This is after Roy Cohn died. These are the guys, because Cohn died in 1986, and ironically, he dies of something else linked to SV40, which is HIV.
AIDS. Yeah,
you got it. So he dies of the same thing. So that's why I think Cohn got what he got coming to him. But
yeah.
The guys in New York that are running real estate, these are the Kushners. Remember who he's married into?
Yes.
They knew the deal with the cement business and how the mob run it. Everybody would go to bid, and they'd have one job that was bid at $10 million for the cement thing. They made sure everybody else's bids came up 12, 15, 20. So they hand selected who would be picked. That's actually how fucking Giuliani took them out. And Gotti thought that he was running a great gig. Eventually, he gets taken out by something that turns out to be really minor. He wasn't as smart as Meyer Lansky. He wasn't running the business. Who was running the accountant business in New York when Lansky's dead? Turns out it's the guys in real estate on Manhattan Island. Mm-hmm. It's the guys in the bank. It's the Sandy Wheels of Travelers, of Citigroup. It's the guys who spawned Jamie Dimon. Those are the guys now, bro. Those are the Meyer Lanskys today.
Yeah.
And this is the reason why those guys fucking hate Bitcoin, because they know exactly what it represents. And let me tell you something. When I was a young man in New York City, and I talked to Theodore Silbert, just so you know who he is,
mm-hmm.
He ran Sterling National Bank as the CEO. He died a long time ago. He was a founding member of B'nai B'rith in New York City. He told me exactly how fucking everything ran. And he told me exactly how Trump got in to the business. Do you know why we talked about Trump? Because Mr. Silbert lived on 75th and Park Avenue. He lived in the fucking penthouse. If you look off his terrace, you know what you see? Waldenberg Park. You know who fixed that? Donald Trump. He came in and saved the job from the fucking mob. The mob was making it run way over because of this fucking cement problem that they were having. So what did Silbert do and his friends? They hooked Trump up and said, look, don't use any laborers from the mob. You'll be able to get this park built really fast, and you'll become a huge favorite in Manhattan, and your real estate business will take off after that. Mm-hmm. That's exactly fucking what happened. So when you, trust me, you don't know your history like I know my history. Remember, my story is New York and New Orleans. So now you know the reason why I know all this stuff. Because most of this story takes place physically in both of those places. And I have the weirdest links ever with people tied to different parts of this story.
I've heard that New Orleans, I don't know if this is overlaps with, QAnon, adrenochrome stuff, but I've heard that New Orleans is a very big hub for, human trafficking and blackmail acquisition and stuff like that.
Dude, it's been part of the occult for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Even that's what New Orleans MO is. There's a lot of nefarious things that went on in New Orleans. Most people don't even realize that the industrial military complex, most of its money was fueled by UEP Long's son as a senator, and also Hale Boggs. The Hale Boggs building is down there. Remember, they killed Hale Boggs in a plane crash in Alaska. Because remember, he sat on the Warren Commission too, and he was getting ready to come out in 1971 against, why? Because he realized his conscience started to bother him. You know why Hale Boggs is a big part of this story? Do you know where the Hill Burton grant for the LINAC came from? Fucking Hale Boggs. How'd I find that out? Talking to John Oshner, Dr. Alton Oshner's son. I said, how the fuck did your father pull this off? He goes, it was easy. He used to be an FBI guy, became a CIA guy, and guess who controlled the budget? Hale Boggs. He was part of the House Ways and Means Committee that basically was able to fund this. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Dude, I went fact checking. He goes, you can go into the medical school library right here. We had a library down there. He goes, go look and see if I'm lying to you. Sure as shit, he was right. And then when I go down to Poydras Street, Hale Boggs' name is on the federal building right there. And I'm looking around, I'm going, dude, this is the craziest fucking thing ever, that all these players are here. Like the office where Roger Bannister, who actually is the FBI handler for Oshner, is literally right at Lafayette Square. I've taken my members to this area. I said, this entrance to this building has an entrance on Magazine Street and on Lafayette Square. That's the reason why there was two addresses, why there was so much confusion in the Warren Commission. They have fucking no idea that there was two addresses there. Dude, this was the biggest fucking scam in scams. But you have to know how they were able to pull it off. And magically, Roger Bannister, the FBI guy, who had all the dirt on Oshner that Garrison got, he magically dies of a heart attack. Do you remember, as a young man in the Church Commission, they showed a gun that causes heart attack?
The heart attack gun, yeah.
He got popped with that, bro.
Wow.
He dies right after JFK's taken out. So magically does Lee Harvey Oswald. So magically does Jack Ruby. You want another part of the side story? So know your history a little bit about Jack Rubenstein. Yeah. Jack Ruby is sitting in jail in Dallas, and what does he tell the people on the Warren Commission? Get me the fuck out of Dallas, because I know the people in Dallas are going to kill me. He doesn't know how, but he knows it's going to happen. So this is where it ties to Mary Sherman's story. The decision to kill him is to use the SV-40 they were going to use for Castro.
Is so Jolly West who gave it to him, you think?
No, Jolly West is who committed him to make sure he couldn't go anywhere. In other words, they used a psychiatric commit to keep him in there. Everybody knew he wasn't crazy, but magically what happens? Then he gets pneumonia in there, and he gets a shot of penicillin from the industrial military doctors who are working with the Dallas police force, who you know are fucking crooked as shit because they're all controlled by Dallas's people.
Yeah.
So he gets the cancer right then and there. But here's the key part of the story to link the timelines together. Go look at when Jack Ruby first gets sick. He gets the fulminant cancer and he eventually dies from it. You know who also magically dies 6 months after the JFK assassination? Mary Sherman is killed in New Orleans by the LINAC. Do you know why? Judith Ferry Baker flees back to Florida. Lee Harvey Oswald is killed. David Ferry is already dead. So the three people running the lab are gone. Who's the one that wasn't? Mary Sherman. She creates the next concoction, radiates it, gives it to the people in Dallas. Jack Ruby gets popped. Magically, they take the grounding cord off the LINAC, and her whole arm is severed. It's actually not severed, but disintegrated. Her whole left side of her thorax is disintegrated. The pictures are actually in two books. Judith Ferry Baker's book is in there. And you can see they move the body. This whole story is there. It's obvious that this is electromagnetic radiation. So guess what? Who do you think had this discussion with me in 2007? Me and Robert Becker. Two guys that know a little bit about non-native EMF. Why? Because we know what the LINAC does. It creates huge amounts both of electric power and EMF. It's the only thing that can disintegrate tissue. You can't fucking get this autopsy from a mattress fire, which is what the NOPD try to tell us. The NOPD and the Dallas PD are as fucking criminal as you can imagine. Why? Who controlled them? Carlos Marsalo, bro. Same fucking guys. It's the mob again. Dude, this story, let me just tell you something. You got way more of the story than Danny ever hoped to get because you didn't put the fucking reins on. You have no idea the depth of the nefariousness. But I'm telling you right now, if this story gets you mad, just remember who's enemy number one. Sergey Brin, Larry Page,
Yeah.
the Wojcicki sisters.
Trust me, I know.
The people in Congress, the people in the executive branch, the people in the CIA, the people in the FBI, they all need to be eliminated. They need Guantanamo Bay. That's where they need to go. Chuck Schumer, bye-bye.
Yeah.
Nancy Pelosi, bye-bye. Adam Schiff, Hillary Clinton. Just remember, we know Comey, all of them, all the players, the Bushes, the ones that are still alive, all of them are. I mean, we didn't even get into how George Bush and the Patriot Act link through Epstein's bedroom. Epstein's bedroom has a picture of him with a fucking paper airplane on it. Why? Because they got the Mossad to train those fucking guys from Saudi Arabia to knock the fucking buildings down.
Yeah, the clean break memo and
the Patriot Act, which is the second most unconstitutional thing. What was the first? The Bank Secrecy Act. Realize how these things are together. These are all things. Now the execution part of this, Sergey Brin, it's Google, it's the screens, it's the Zuckerbergs.
There's one other aspect of it I wanted to talk to you about. When we probably got to wrap this up pretty soon, but the other aspect of that, is that, during the 60s and when they were really rolling out MKUltra into the streets, and the drugs were a big part of it. It's my opinion that the main way that they promoted those was through the music industry. And if you read anything like Dave McGowan's Weird Scenes in the Canyon, and he talks about all those artists, whether it's Zappa or Jim Morrison, being tied to intelligentsia. Well, I mean, that stuff, why I asked about Kurt Plotkin is that stuff goes as far back as Aleister Crowley working for MI6, and he wrote this book that supposedly was lost called Liber Cactus, where he would put on these shows and experiment with mescaline on people.
We talked about Ozzy. Ozzy wrote a song about Alex Crowley.
Yeah.
So, this, I totally agree with you here, but I would tell you, I think the thing that does musicians in more than anything else, the drugs are a big thing, but it's the light. It's the fact that you guys use electrified instruments and you do it mostly at night. That's really the fuel. I think where that really changed was in the 60s, because in the 60s, a lot of concerts were still done outside and in the sun. But what changed everything was actually Woodstock. Woodstock was that movement. You had McKenna at that time. You had a lot of things happening in the 60s and around this. And, a lot of people don't know that Jim Morrison's dad was the psyops that began the Bay of Tonkin affair. His dad was part of this. So I totally agree with you that the music industry was polluted then. But I would tell you, the prostitution, the pedophilia, all of that was Meyer Lansky's idea that eventually winds up with Maxwell and Epstein. But do I think the music stuff gets taken in the 60s? That's when you have all the big record companies start to realize that they could use the drugs to control a lot of the artists. But I think the real control of the music business doesn't happen until the Clintons get in. The Clintons, I think, really where the music business gets very, very dark. This is,
why do you say that?
Well, because where it gets bad is after hip hop. Like, I will tell you, post hip hop,
right, with the private prison systems and stuff,
fucking nasty. That's when you have probably some of the most nefarious stuff out. I mean, it started really with the control of Michael Jackson, but I can tell you the stuff that went on with Sony, with not only Michael Jackson but Tommy Mottola, dude, they made him out to be a pedophile when it turns out they were the fucking pedophiles. And the crazy part of the story, I've written stories about Michael Jackson. He's the poster child for what I'm trying to teach you about POMC and melanin. He gets vitiligo. He can't sleep. He falls apart. It's very similar to the story, my friend, of Len Sassaman, who I think is Satoshi. Why? Because Michael can't sleep. and he's
Hmm.
using ketamine to sleep, from my work that I talked with Huberman about, that I'm a big fan of the use of psychedelics and things like ketamine when people have tech abuse. It helps them get off the ledge, but you can't use it chronically.
Yeah.
Sadly, Michael Jackson gets taken out because he can't sleep because he hires a fucking guy who's an idiot. Um, if he had hired an anesthesiologist, he probably would still be alive today.
Right.
But I believe the kid's life was ruined, by the record executives that he worked with. But remember, he's the first artist that really tried to gain control back. I'd even
Right.
tell you that I think Prince is another one because they're Prince is a little bit later, but Prince goes out almost the same way Michael does because of the drugs.
And he was saying the same things that Michael Jackson
Exactly
was
right.
too
And then you
before
think
he
about what
died.
happened to Chris Cornell, and you think about Benningfield, and then they were really against child trafficking and the pedophilia. They were against the Weinsteins.
Well, a lot of people say Podesta, Tony Podesta was Bennington's father. That's a really
Right.
big conspiracy theory.
Well, I get that, but I'm going to tell you that Podesta he's one of the, I'd say, Grows 3, 4, 4.0. You have
Hmm.
to realize Podesta is the most nefarious person connected to the Clintons.
Hmm.
Doug Benn is also another guy that's really bad. He was with the Clintons all the way through, and
Well, those WikiLeaks emails themselves, I mean,
right.
those are some of the creepiest things in the whole world you read.
Well, remember, you want to hear something else that links these two stories that you probably haven't thought about? How does WikiLeaks get funded? Bitcoin.
Hmm.
Think about that, bro. Do you realize why these people really fucking hate Bitcoin? Because honestly, WikiLeaks probably does. They tried to silence Julian Assange first through control of the banking system.
Hmm.
They couldn't do that. Then they saw that Bitcoin could be used to still release the stuff. Then what happens? Then you actually have Mike Pompeo and Clinton saying, "Let's just fucking kill the WikiLeaks guy." Dude, it's all these pieces are so fucking in front of you
Yeah.
that it's just mind-boggling to me that I'm the first guy that's actually put all the pieces together. But let me just tell you something. You have to realize that this has made up the bulk of your young life. It's actually made up the bulk of my old life. And the
I know.
problem is the reason I'm mad about it is different than you're mad. Your world is being stolen. My world, if I'm lucky, I have another 20 years left, but they stole my fucking profession, bro. They stole my modus operandi of being a doctor and doing it for the right reasons. And they are fucking killing millions of people. I think I told Danny this, and I'm telling you the same thing. I've done the math. I think it's close to about 500 million people have died at the hand of General Gross. That's how fucking nefarious. He makes Hitler look like a street criminal. And do I think the 4 million number of Hitler is an accurate number? I don't, for a variety of different reasons, but it's the story that the criminals that are in this story want to perpetrate out there because they want you to realize they're not the bad guys. When it turns out they killed way more Christians in the Bolshevik
Right.
Revolution. And I'm kind of hoping that guy Martyr made in his podcast, when he gets to talking about Churchill and
Yeah.
this whole story, he lays that out further. I've already done that homework, but to be
Yeah.
honest with you, part of the story doesn't fucking really interest me because it's not really germane to the story that I'm telling you now. We're all in this.
And it just gets you further deplatformed too.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the big thing right now is I need people to realize they need to plug into decentralized health
Hmm.
and decentralized wealth. And I think clearly on this podcast, I have made that case for you. Why
Hmm.
these two things are incredibly and indelibly linked. And it's incumbent upon you as a young man to get this thing out. Hopefully, you get it out before everybody votes, but you also continue to share this message that there's fucking people hiding everywhere that are the biggest criminals in the fucking world, and we need to take them out.
Hmm. I agree. I
So
mean,
our duty
it's
as
just a matter
patriots,
of how we do it. And that's where
right?
it gets tricky.
Well, I can tell you that Trump's transition team, they got a plan. That's all I can say.
Are you working on any official
Can't say
level?
anything. Can't say anything.
Okay. Worth asking. Well, hey, Jack, I really appreciate you taking the time. I don't want to keep you too much longer, But I really appreciate what you're doing. I mean, there's nobody really, I think, that puts these things together and has the firsthand perspective, like you do. So I hope you'll continue doing that, and maybe we'll get to talk about it again sometime.
No problem. Let me
Thanks a
know when you
lot.
get this thing out so we can start sharing it because I think this one will be very interesting for everybody, no matter
Yeah,
which side of the aisle you're on.
absolutely. Yeah. And it's one of those things where those people need to be brought together, not divided down the political lines.
No,
That's when some change
we
can
just
start
need to make
happening,
sure we know the big offender right now, Sergey Brin. We need Sergey Brin head on a fucking platter.
figuratively, of course, right?
Oh, absolutely. And wouldn't be bad to have Bill Gates beside him.
Yeah, well, that'd be lovely. We'll see.
All right. Take care,
Thanks a
my
lot.
friend.
Take
All right.
care.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.